It was a late summer evening in 2021 when my friends and I decided to go camping at Blue Ridge National Park. We had all been in school together, and it had been a while since we'd taken a trip like this. Just us, the wilderness, and the freedom to get away from our daily lives. We were young, around 23, eager for adventure, and the campsite we picked was about 3 hours outside of our hometown of Greenfield, Indiana. The location seemed perfect, secluded, away from other campers, and nestled deep in the woods. We arrived just before sunset, the sky painted with hues of orange and purple. The air had a crispness to it, but the warmth from the sun kept the chill away. We unloaded the car, unpacking our gear and setting up our tents by the edge of a small, tranquil stream. The water trickled gently over smooth rocks, and the woods around us were silent, except for the occasional bird call. It was peaceful, the kind of serenity I hadn't experienced in a long time. The ground was soft beneath our feet, and the fire pit was already cleared, just waiting for a blaze to bring light to the evening. We gathered around the pit, the sound of dry twigs snapping underfoot as we made the fire, our faces lit by the flickering flames. It was one of those nights where everything felt perfect, like nothing could go wrong. We ate dinner, laughed, and shared stories under the open sky, the stars slowly appearing as the darkness crept in. But then, as the evening wore on, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on right away, just a nagging sense that I wasn't entirely alone. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something moving at the edge of the woods. Of course, it was probably just my imagination. The forest can do that to you, make you feel like you're being watched even when you know you're not. Later, after the fire died down to a few embers, we retreated to our tents for the night. I was in the tent closest to the creek with Emma, one of my best friends. The others were scattered in the tents further down the line, but Emma and I were the closest to the water, which seemed calming. The first few hours passed without incident. I could hear the soft rhythm of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, just the sound of nature. But around midnight, I woke up to the distinct sound of twigs snapping. I wasn't sure if it was an animal, but it was too close for comfort. I lay there in the dark, holding my breath, straining to listen. The sounds came again, and this time I could tell they were coming from just beyond the camp. My heart started pounding in my chest. At first, I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer or some other animal. But as I listened, I realized it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. There was a deliberate, almost human-like quality to the sound, as if whatever was out there was trying to move quietly but wasn't doing a very good job of it. I looked over at Emma, who was still sound asleep beside me. I wanted to wake her up, but I didn't want to scare her unnecessarily. Instead, I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and tried to ignore the noise, telling myself I was being paranoid. But then the sounds grew closer. Twigs snapped louder, followed by a low, soft scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy over the ground. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up quietly, trying not to disturb Emma, and unzipped the tent. The cool night air hit me, and I stepped outside, my eyes scanning the darkness. The fire had long since burned out, and only the faintest glow of embers remained. I looked towards the woods, and for a moment, I saw nothing. Then I saw it. There was a figure standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the dim light. At first, I thought it might be one of my friends messing around, but then I noticed something off about it. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, and it was standing completely still, watching our camp. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't move. The figure didn't seem to notice me, or if it did, it didn't care. I watched it for what felt like an eternity, my heart thudding in my chest. The more I stared, the more I realized how wrong everything felt. It didn't belong there. It wasn't one of us, and it wasn't an animal. It was just a person or something that looked like one, standing in the dark, watching us. Finally, I snapped out of my trance and ducked back into the tent, zipping it up behind me. I lay there in the dark, trying to breathe slowly and steady my shaking hands. I wanted to wake Emma, but I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to freak her out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still out there, waiting. I don't know how long I lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest. The longer I lay there, the more unsettled I became. It wasn't just the figure. I had this overwhelming sense of unease, like something was wrong with the entire campsite. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the woods themselves were alive, watching, listening. Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the stress of the night. The next morning, I woke up to bright sunlight streaming through the trees. I immediately felt a sense of relief, but also confusion. Had it all been a dream? Had I imagined the figure? I wasn't sure. Emma was already up, sitting by the remains of the fire pit, sipping her coffee. She looked up as I approached, giving me a small smile. "Morning," she said. "You sleep okay?" I hesitated, then nodded, not wanting to sound paranoid. "Yeah, just a little restless." We spent the morning eating breakfast, packing up our gear, and talking about what we wanted to do for the rest of the day. We decided to go for a hike around the area, exploring more of the park. The strange feeling from the night before lingered, but I didn't mention it. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being overdramatic. We left the campsite around noon, walking deeper into the woods. The further we got, the more isolated we felt. It was beautiful, sure, lush green trees, thick underbrush, and the occasional patch of sunlight breaking through the canopy. But there was something about the quiet that felt wrong, like there was something just beyond the trees, watching us. As we walked, we came across a narrow trail that led up a small hill. We decided to climb it, eager to get a better view of the surrounding area. The climb was steeper than we expected, and by the time we reached the top, we were winded and sweaty. The view was amazing: rolling hills, more forest, and in the distance, the faint outline of a small lake. We were standing there, taking it all in, when I noticed something odd in the distance. A figure standing motionless at the edge of the trees, just like the one I saw last night. I froze, staring at it, my stomach dropping. Emma must have noticed the look on my face because she turned to look, too. But when she glanced back at me, she didn't seem alarmed. "What's wrong?" she asked. I shook my head, feeling foolish. I think I saw that same figure last night." Emma frowned, looking back toward the trees. The figure was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the forest. "Maybe it was just someone else camping," she suggested, trying to reassure me. But I wasn't convinced. I felt that cold, creeping dread again, like we weren't supposed to be there. I tried to push the thought aside, but it lingered, growing stronger with every step. That afternoon, we packed up and decided to leave early, cutting our trip short. Something about that place didn't sit right with me. The quiet, the feeling of being watched, the strange figure in the woods. It all felt too much. As we drove away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for us, that we had disturbed something that was never meant to be disturbed. We never went back to Blue Ridge National Park. To this day, I can't explain what I saw that night or the strange, unsettling feeling that followed us. All I know is that sometimes, when you're out in the wilderness, you can feel the weight of something unseen watching you from the shadows. And sometimes you don't realize how close it really is. The wind whipped through the trees, making the leaves rustle like whispers in the dark. It wasn't quite evening, but the fading light was enough to cast long shadows across the woods. The kind of shadows that seemed to stretch just a little too far, almost like they were trying to move on their own. I was 28 years old, alone for the first time in a long while. My name's Jack, and I thought this camping trip would be an escape from everything. My life had been chaotic, always filled with work, responsibilities, and endless obligations. So when I found a weekend free, I decided to hike out to a secluded campsite near Blackwood Forest, a place I'd never been before. It seemed peaceful enough when I read the description online. Quiet, tucked away, with a stream that would make the perfect backdrop for a few days of solitude. Arriving early that morning, I packed my gear, set up my tent, and began to explore the area. The campground was small, with only a few sites spread out in the woods. The air smelled fresh, and the chirping of birds was the only noise that cut through the otherwise silent space. It felt good to be away from the city, to disconnect. For a while, everything was calm, but as night began to fall, I felt an unease settle over me. It wasn't the forest itself. No, the forest was calm, its trees standing tall, unmoving. It was something about the air. It had a stillness to it that seemed too thick, too unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not in the sense of someone else walking around the campsite, but in the sense that something was out there, watching, waiting. I tried to shake it off. I set up a small fire near my tent and pulled out my camp stove to cook some food. I thought about reading a book or maybe listening to some music, but the sound of the wind and the occasional snap of a twig kept pulling my attention toward the forest. The fire crackled, sending orange sparks into the sky, but my mind kept drifting back to the unsettling stillness of the woods. As the evening grew darker, the shadows lengthened and seemed to spread across the ground, stretching just a little too far. I felt that familiar itch in my chest, the same feeling I got when something was off, when I was being watched. The unease grew stronger as the fire burned lower. I checked my watch. It was already past 9:30 p.m., the forest now completely enveloped in darkness. I looked around again, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. No animals, no insects, not even the breeze. Everything was quiet, and I felt like I was the only living thing for miles. I stepped away from the fire, deciding to walk around the site a little to calm my nerves. The darkness made the forest seem endless, like the trees were closing in around me. My flashlight bounced across the trail as I moved, the light cutting through the dark like a sharp blade. That's when I heard it. A twig snapped. Just one. A soft but distinct crack. I froze. I stood still for what felt like an eternity, trying to listen for any other sounds. But the wind didn't pick up. The leaves didn't rustle. The air felt thick, like the world was holding its breath. Then came another snap, followed by a low rustling noise, like something large moving in the underbrush. I felt my heart rate spike. My breath caught in my throat. It was too quiet, far too quiet. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but my instincts screamed that it wasn't. I started walking back toward the fire, my pace quickening. Just as I was about to break into a run, I heard a sound that froze me completely. It wasn't the rustle of leaves or the snap of a branch. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Someone or something was walking toward me. I didn't know what to do. There was no one else around, no other campers, nothing. Just me and the growing noise of someone or something moving closer. My thoughts scrambled, and a million scenarios played out in my head. None of them good. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it toward the noise, but I couldn't see anything. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating only empty forest and shadows. The footsteps stopped, dead silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the beating of my own heart. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. It was barely visible, standing just outside the circle of light. A shadow among shadows. I could make out nothing but a silhouette, just tall enough to be human, but too still, too unmoving. My breath hitched, and my legs trembled as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. My body refused to cooperate. Then, without warning, the figure stepped forward. I barely had time to react. The light from my flashlight illuminated it just enough for me to see that it wasn't a person at all. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, but something was wrong. Its skin was pale, almost sickly, and its eyes glowed in the dark, reflecting the light in a way that didn't seem natural. Its mouth opened, but no sound came from it. It just stood there, staring at me with that eerie, unnatural stillness. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I didn't care about trying to figure out what it was. I only cared about getting away. I ran, heart pounding, back toward my tent. The footsteps behind me grew louder, faster. Whatever it was following me. I reached my tent, scrambled inside, and zipped it up as fast as I could. I grabbed my knife from my backpack and sat, holding my breath, listening. The sound of footsteps continued, circling the campsite now. The thing was pacing around me, as if waiting for something. Minutes felt like hours. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I stayed still, holding the knife tight in my hand, listening for any hint of movement. But there was nothing, not a sound. Eventually, I mustered the courage to peek out of the tent. The fire had burned down to embers, casting an eerie glow across the campsite. The forest around me was completely silent again. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my gear, packed as quickly as I could, and ran toward the nearest trail. I didn't even care about checking if the figure was still out there. I just needed to leave. The hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up, and I could still feel that sense of being watched, like eyes were boring into the back of my skull. I didn't stop running until I reached the park entrance, the road, and safety. When I looked back, the forest seemed peaceful again. Too peaceful. The woods were quiet, almost as if nothing had happened at all. I never went back to that campsite. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. But what I do know is that some places aren't meant to be explored. Some things in the forest aren't meant to be found. And some nights, the darkness is just too quiet, too still. I'd always enjoyed the quiet solitude of camping, even if it meant a little discomfort here and there. The smells of fresh pine, the feeling of the cool evening air biting at your skin, the peacefulness. There was nothing quite like it. My name's Jake, and I was 34 years old when this particular trip happened. I'd been camping for years, but this time, something felt different. Something felt wrong, though I didn't know exactly what it was at first. I decided to go alone this time, as my wife and kids were busy with other things, and I just needed to get away. After a bit of research, I found a campground a few hours north in the Cascade Mountains. It wasn't the most popular site, which was part of the reason it caught my attention. I liked places that weren't overrun by people, where you could feel like you had the forest to yourself. It was secluded, deep in the woods, and seemed perfect for what I was looking for. A quiet getaway to disconnect. I arrived at the campground in the late afternoon. The sun was still high in the sky, but the trees loomed tall and dense. The air had that earthy smell I'd grown to love over the years, and there was something oddly still about the place. Not a bird, not a squirrel, not even a rustling breeze. It was almost too quiet. I drove down the narrow gravel road that led to the campsites, passing a few scattered wooden signs warning about bears and other wildlife. Nothing unusual stood out except for the lack of any other vehicles. It was a Wednesday, so maybe it wasn't a popular day for camping, but still, I had expected to see at least a few other people. But the lot was empty. I parked my truck, grabbed my gear, and started walking to the designated site. There was something off about the place right away, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The trees felt too dense, too close. It was hard to explain, but the woods around me felt almost suffocating, like they were closing in. Setting up camp didn't take long. I pitched my tent, unpacked my supplies, and started a fire. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped quickly, and I built up the fire for warmth. The glow of the flames cast strange shadows on the trees around me, their long limbs reaching out like fingers. I spent the first hour or so sitting by the fire, roasting some food and enjoying the quiet. I could hear the crackling of the fire and the occasional snap of a twig, but other than that, there wasn't a single sound. I kept glancing over my shoulder, as if expecting to see something moving in the corner of my vision. But every time I turned, it was just more trees and the fading light. The first odd thing happened as I was about to turn in for the night. I noticed something on the ground near the edge of my camp, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It looked like footprints, large ones with deep impressions, like they had been left by something heavy. They were fresh too, just a few hours old, I would guess. But the strangest part? They weren't human footprints. They didn't resemble anything I'd seen in the woods before. They had 3 toes and the outline was uneven, almost clawed. I told myself it was probably some kind of animal, maybe a bear or a large wolf. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That quiet, oppressive stillness seemed to press in closer, and I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder. I decided to stay by the fire, not wanting to risk wandering off into the dark woods. The camp was small, just my tent, the fire, and a small picnic table. Nothing that could really shelter me from whatever might be lurking nearby. I woke up around midnight to the sound of something moving just outside my tent. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a raccoon, but then the sound came again, louder this time and closer. I held my breath, straining to listen. The rustling was deliberate, slow, as if something was moving carefully around my camp. My heart started racing. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent cautiously, poking my head out. There was nothing in sight, just the fire, still crackling faintly, and the dark trees beyond. But the feeling of being watched hadn't left. I stood up, grabbed my bear spray, and walked slowly toward the edge of the camp where the footprints had been earlier. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but nothing stood out. There were no new tracks, no signs of movement. Yet the air felt heavier now, and I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was close by. I made my way back to the fire, trying to calm my nerves. I kept thinking about the footprints, how unusual they had been. They didn't look like any animal tracks I had ever seen, and that thought kept gnawing at me. Around 2 a.m., the rustling started again. This time it was closer, right at the edge of my tent. I grabbed the flashlight again, but this time I didn't wait. I ran out of the tent, the beam of the light slicing through the darkness. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw it. A large figure was standing near the trees, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was tall, much taller than any person I'd ever seen, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch out unnaturally. I froze, heart pounding, as I watched the figure sway slightly. It didn't move toward me, but I could feel the tension in the air, like it was waiting for something. I don't know how long I stood there, unable to move, but eventually, the figure faded into the shadows. It was like it just dissolved into the darkness. I don't know if I imagined it or if it was real, but something in my gut told me that whatever I had seen, it wasn't good. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting by the fire, watching the woods for any sign of movement. The night felt endless, and the stillness seemed to stretch on forever. Every rustling sound, every snap of a twig, made my heart race, but nothing else came near. The fire died down as the hours passed, and the first light of dawn started to creep through the trees. By the time morning came, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. The fear, the tension, the weirdness of the place. It was too much. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, not daring to take another step into the woods. I didn't even want to look behind me. As I drove away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me the whole time. The drive back was long, and I kept glancing nervously at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. But nothing ever did. When I got home, I did some research on the area. There had been a few reports of strange animal sightings, but nothing concrete. No one had ever mentioned anything that resembled what I had seen. There were no records of creatures with three-toed footprints, or of large, spindly figures lurking in the woods. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was something else. But I've never gone back to that campground, and I don't think I ever will. I've camped in a lot of places since then, but none of them have felt quite right either. Something about that place, that night, lingers in my memory, and I'm not sure I'll ever fully understand what happened. It was late September, and I had finally managed to carve out a weekend to myself. My name is Andrew, and I've always been an avid camper. Not the kind who sets up near crowded campgrounds with picnic tables and bathrooms, but the kind who likes to get away from civilization and find a spot deep in the woods, away from the noise and bustle. The kind of camping where you feel truly alone, where the only company you have is the wind and the trees. I was in my early 30s, single and ready for a little solitude. This time, I had decided on a spot in the Appalachian foothills, somewhere not too far from my home in Kentucky, but far enough that it still felt like an escape. I'd read about it in a hiking forum online. A small, quiet patch of forest near a creek, tucked away in the hills, with nothing around for miles. It seemed perfect, just what I needed. I packed up my gear and set off early that Friday morning. It was a 3-hour drive, and I used the time to clear my mind and relax. The weather was ideal, sunny with a cool breeze, the kind of day that makes you appreciate being outside. The drive took me through small towns, past forests with colorful fall foliage starting to set in, and finally into the deeper, more remote sections of the Appalachian Mountains. When I arrived at the parking area near the trailhead, I was relieved to find I was the only one there. I didn't expect to see anyone, and that was just the way I liked it. I checked my map, grabbed my backpack, and started down the narrow trail leading deeper into the forest. The sounds of the world faded quickly as I hiked further in. It was just me and the crunch of fallen leaves beneath my boots. The hike was peaceful. The trail meandered through dense woods, winding along small ridges and dipping into valleys. The creek I was headed to wasn't far, just a couple of miles. I found it quickly enough, a stream running clear and cold over smooth stones. It was the kind of place you could imagine spending hours just sitting and listening to the water. I set up camp near the creek, pitching my tent by the water's edge. I built a small fire, gathered some dry wood, and sat down to enjoy the serenity. It wasn't until late afternoon that the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows over the forest floor. I had dinner, just a simple meal of canned chili and crackers, and settled in by the fire. The night came fast, and the temperature dropped, but the fire kept me warm. Around 9 p.m., I heard something that made me pause, a rustling in the trees. It wasn't a wind-blown sound. It was deliberate, something moving through the underbrush. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but as I sat there, I realized it was something heavier, something bigger. Person? I quickly dismissed the idea. There was no way anyone would be out here this late. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, shining it toward the noise. Nothing, just the dim shadows of the trees swaying in the breeze. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe a deer or some other animal was just passing through. But the feeling lingered. I returned to my fire and tried to push it out of my mind. The sounds of the night slowly returned, the occasional crack of a branch, the wind rustling through the leaves. I sat there for a while longer, making sure to keep the fire going strong. But when I finally crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. Something wasn't right. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept returning to that sound, that rustling. I eventually drifted off, but it wasn't the deep sleep I had hoped for. It was fitful, restless. Around 2 a.m., I was woken by a loud crash, like something big had fallen in the woods. My eyes snapped open. I listened, heart pounding in my chest, waiting for another sound. There it was again, a crashing noise, followed by a series of heavy thuds, like something or someone was moving through the forest in a hurry. My first instinct was to freeze, to stay quiet and listen. I couldn't tell where the noise was coming from. It was too distant, but it was close enough that it made my blood run cold. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A moose? Maybe even someone else hiking late at night. But something about the sound felt wrong. It didn't have the regularity of an animal, and it was too human. The way the branches snapped, the way the ground thudded under the weight of whatever was out there. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling as I flicked it on and shined it toward the door of the tent. The light barely cut through the darkness of the forest. I waited, holding my breath. There was nothing. The noise had stopped. For a moment, I thought I imagined it, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I stayed awake for hours that night, listening to the sounds of the forest, straining my ears for anything unusual. The crashing noises never came back, but the feeling of being watched never left. By morning, I was exhausted. I packed up my camp in silence, my mind still racing from the previous night. I had planned to stay for another night, but I wasn't sure I could do it. Something about this place felt off now, like I had crossed some invisible boundary. Maybe I was just being paranoid, I thought, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in these woods. I hiked out, my pace faster than usual, the quiet of the forest now unnerving rather than peaceful. As I made my way back to the parking lot, I passed the trailhead where I had entered the night before. There, at the edge of the path, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A footprint, large, deep, and unmistakable. It wasn't a bear's, and it wasn't the print of any animal I recognized. It was human. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I stared at the footprint for a long time, my mind racing. It was fresh, probably made within the last few hours. There was no way someone could have hiked this far out without being noticed. My heart was pounding in my chest as I looked around, expecting to see someone emerge from the woods, but there was nothing, just the quiet, still forest. I quickly turned and hurried the rest of the way back to my car. The feeling of being followed, of something just out of sight, stayed with me the entire hike back. When I reached my car, I didn't hesitate. I threw my pack in the back, slammed the door, and drove off as fast as I could, not looking back. As I made my way back to the main road, the thoughts in my head swirled. That was the last time I went camping alone in the woods. I was 32 the summer I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the remote forests of northern Vermont. It was 2022. I had just gotten out of a long relationship, and my mind was tangled up. I needed to clear my head, and being outside always seemed to help. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the sound of cars, far from any cell phone towers or bright lights. Just me, some trees, and the sound of the wind. I packed my old dark green backpack with everything I thought I would need. Tent, sleeping bag, a camp stove, a first aid kit, 2 knives, matches, a couple of changes of clothes, a good rain jacket, a map, compass, and a little extra food. I also brought a small hatchet, figuring I could collect dead wood for fires. I didn't even bring my phone, just a cheap old flip phone for emergencies. I liked the idea of cutting myself off. The place I picked was called Aldridge Forest. It wasn't a national park, just a huge stretch of state land without any real facilities. No campgrounds, no rangers, just a few dirt access roads winding through miles of woods and hills. It wasn't a place tourists usually went. It was too rugged. Some locals hunted deer there in the fall, but in the middle of summer it was basically empty. I drove my old Subaru along a gravel road for what felt like forever, my tires crunching over rocks and kicking up dust. Trees pressed close on either side, the sunlight slashing through in thin beams. Finally, when the road got too narrow for comfort, I pulled off onto a little clearing just big enough to park. I locked the car, shouldered my heavy pack, and started hiking north into the trees. The air smelled thick and sweet, the way deep woods always do in the heat. After about 3 hours of hiking, I found a spot that seemed good enough. It was a little higher ground, fairly flat, surrounded by thick pine and a few big oaks. A small creek ran maybe 50 yards off to the west, trickling and gurgling over mossy rocks. I set up camp there. Tent first, staked down good and tight, then I collected rocks and built a little fire ring. I worked up a sweat-gathering armloads of dead branches and twigs. Afterward, I boiled water from the creek with purification tablets and made a cheap dehydrated meal for dinner. As the sun dropped, the woods filled with that deep, buzzing chorus of insects. I sat by my fire until it burned down low, then crawled into my tent and zipped it tight. The first night passed easy enough. I woke once or twice to the sounds of small animals rustling in the underbrush, but I was too tired to care. I slept hard. The second day was hotter. I spent the morning hiking around, exploring the hills. I found a deer path, old scat, some claw marks on a tree that looked like they might be from a black bear. Nothing unusual for Vermont. I felt good, tired, sunburned, but clear-headed for the first time in a while. That afternoon, I hiked further upstream along the creek and found a little pond, maybe 50 feet across. It looked deep in the middle, the water almost black with shadow. I stripped down and jumped in. The cold water shocked the breath out of me, but after a few minutes, it felt amazing. By the time I made it back to camp, it was late. The woods had that heavy, dusky feel like they were settling in for the night. I made another fire and cooked a simple dinner. I sat there, watching the flames lick up toward the stars, feeling that good kind of loneliness settle in my chest. That was when I heard something strange. It was a snap, sharp and sudden, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. I froze, listening hard. Could have been a deer, maybe even a bear. I picked up my hatchet without thinking, my heart starting to thump faster. Then silence. Nothing moved. The woods went still in that way they do when something big is nearby. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a branch falling. I put a few more logs on the fire and forced myself to relax. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was close. That night I slept light. Every little sound snapped me awake. I kept the hatchet tucked inside my sleeping bag, my hand resting on it. Nothing came near the tent, though. When dawn finally came, it felt like a relief. I decided to stay close to camp that day. I kept the fire going low most of the morning and sharpened my knives on a flat rock I found. I stacked more wood, refilled my water supply, tried to keep busy. But I couldn't ignore the feeling creeping up the back of my neck like cold fingers. By afternoon, the sun was blazing down, baking the ground dry. I sat in the shade, drinking water, trying to read an old paperback I brought. That's when I noticed something weird. There was a mark on one of the big oak trees near my tent. It looked fresh, long scratches in the bark, deep enough that the sap was still wet. I hadn't seen it before. They were higher up than I could reach even if I jumped. Bears could do that, sure, but it didn't sit right. The marks weren't spread like claw marks. They were straight, deep, deliberate. It felt wrong, but I didn't know what to do about it. It's not like I could pack up and leave right that second. I told myself again that it was just a bear. Maybe it reared up and raked the tree. Happens all the time. Still, that night I built the fire bigger, and I kept the hatchet even closer. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up with a jolt. It wasn't a sound that woke me. It was the feeling, like my body knew before my mind caught up. I lay still, barely breathing. There it was, a crunch, very slow, a footstep, leaves and twigs under something heavy, closer to the tent. Another step, then nothing. The silence felt thick enough to choke on. I could hear my own heart thudding in my ears. I gripped the hatchet and waited. I strained my eyes at the tent walls, but there was no shadow, no sound of breathing. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't moving. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Could have been 5 minutes, could have been an hour. I never heard anything else. Eventually, exhausted, I drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. When morning came, the first thing I did was check around the tent. There were tracks, not animal tracks, boots, big ones with heavy tread. They circled the tent twice, then led off into the woods. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't a hunter. No hunter in their right mind would mess with another camper, especially not this deep in the woods, where mistakes could mean real danger. And anyway, hunting season wasn't even open. It was someone else, someone who had been watching me. I packed up fast, heart racing, hands fumbling with the tent poles. I didn't even bother cooking breakfast. I stuffed everything into my pack, stamped out the fire, and started hiking south toward the car. I kept the hatchet in my hand the whole time. The woods felt different now. Every snapping branch, every flutter of leaves, every shadow between the trees made me flinch. I didn't know if the person was still out there watching me. I didn't know if they were waiting for me to relax, to let my guard down. I didn't even stop to rest. I just kept moving, my legs burning, sweat soaking through my shirt. Took longer than I thought to reach the car. I must have gotten turned around somewhere. The woods here all looked the same, endless trees, endless green. I forced myself to stay calm, checking my compass again and again, matching it to the map. Finally, after what felt like hours, I spotted the glint of metal through the trees. The Subaru. I almost cried with relief. I stumbled the last few yards and jammed the key into the lock with shaking fingers. Threw my pack into the back, slammed the door shut, and peeled out down the gravel road, tires sliding. I didn't stop driving until I hit a paved road and saw other cars. Civilization. I found a gas station and sat in the parking lot for a long time, trying to steady my breathing. Later, when I got home, I reported the tracks to the local police. They took it seriously, said they'd send someone to check the area. Maybe they did. I never heard back. I didn't really expect to. I never went back to Aldridge Forest. Not even close. I stuck to public campgrounds after that, the kind with bathrooms and rangers and other people nearby. I still love the woods. I still love camping. But I don't kid myself anymore. It's not the bears or wolves you need to be afraid of out there. It's people. Real people. And sometimes they are much worse. I had always enjoyed camping. The smell of pine trees, the crisp air, and the quiet. Everything about it calmed me. I had been camping with my friends, some of them for years, and others only recently introduced to the experience. This trip was supposed to be no different. A weekend getaway in the wilderness of northern Idaho, just outside of Boise. We picked a spot along a quiet lake, far enough from the main trail that it felt secluded, yet not too far to be unsafe. It was a place we all agreed would be perfect for a weekend retreat. We arrived around mid-afternoon on a Friday. The sun was still high in the sky, and the temperature was perfect, warm enough to be comfortable but cool enough to avoid overheating. We set up camp quickly, unrolling sleeping bags and putting up tents, the usual routine. I remember the smell of fresh earth and pine needles as we gathered around the fire pit, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, and the constant hum of insects in the background. That first night was peaceful. We ate hot dogs and marshmallows, told stories, and enjoyed each other's company. There was no rush, no reason to worry, but something about the place felt off to me. It wasn't anything I could point to directly. There wasn't a specific noise or eerie presence that made my skin crawl. It was just a feeling, something I couldn't shake. I didn't mention it to the group. No one else seemed to feel it, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. Still, every time I looked toward the tree line beyond our camp, I felt uneasy. The next day, we went on a hike, exploring the nearby trails. The sun was higher in the sky, and the woods were even more beautiful than before, with the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. We passed a few small streams and stopped to dip our feet in the cool water. The world felt quiet, peaceful, almost too peaceful. We returned to camp in the late afternoon, tired but content. The fire pit had burned down to a few embers, and the tents were still where we left them, standing tall against the growing evening. The air was beginning to chill, and the sounds of the forest around us had changed. Less insects, more birds settling in for the night, and the wind picking up in the trees. We were all getting ready for dinner, but something had changed. The feeling of unease that I couldn't shake earlier in the trip had returned, stronger now. As the night set in, I began to feel like we were being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone or something to be standing just beyond the reach of the firelight. But every time I turned around, I was met with only the darkness of the forest. My friends didn't seem to notice. They laughed, joked, and roasted marshmallows as if nothing was wrong. But I couldn't ignore the tightness in my chest. I tried to push it aside. It was just my imagination, right? The dark forest, the unfamiliar sounds, the long day. It was all adding up. Maybe I was just tired. I laid back in my sleeping bag that night, staring up at the canvas of stars above. The crackling of the fire was soothing at first, but then, as the night deepened, I realized something. The fire was the only sound I could hear. No rustling leaves, no wildlife calls, just that unnatural silence. I decided to get up and check the perimeter of the camp. I had done this many times before during other trips, but tonight it felt different. There was no moon, only the faintest glimmer of starlight to guide me. I grabbed a flashlight and walked a short distance from the camp. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, revealing tree trunks, patches of underbrush, and the occasional rustling of a small animal. I kept walking, slowly, until I found myself near the edge of the tree line. The forest here was dense, with thick undergrowth that made it difficult to see very far into the woods. That's when I heard it, a snap, like a branch breaking far in the distance. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I waited, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or maybe a bear, moving through the woods, but it didn't sound like an animal. It was too loud, too deliberate. I turned back toward camp, my breath shallow. As I walked, I kept hearing it. Small snaps, distant but closer now, almost like footsteps. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following me. I picked up my pace, trying to act normal, but my mind was racing. I thought of bears, wolves, and mountain lions, all of which were known to roam in these woods, but none of them would make the sounds I was hearing. I glanced over my shoulder, shining the flashlight into the trees behind me, but all I saw was darkness. When I returned to camp, my friends were still sitting around the fire. No one had noticed I was gone. I took a seat and tried to act casual, but I couldn't shake the nervous energy. The snapping sounds continued in the distance, echoing through the trees like someone was walking just out of sight. The fire flickered, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. At some point, I excused myself and crawled into my tent, trying to distract myself with the muffled sounds of the forest outside. But the noises didn't stop. They continued well into the night, branches snapping, twigs cracking, as though something was pacing around our camp. My heart raced with every sound. Every time I tried to sleep, I was jolted awake by a new noise, a new disturbance. At around 3 in the morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped my tent and crept out, trying not to wake anyone. I grabbed a large stick from the fire pit, reasoning that it was better to be prepared. I walked a little further into the woods, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The sounds had stopped for a while, but I still felt the tension in the air, like I was walking into something I couldn't see. Then, from the edge of the forest, I saw something. At first, it was just a shadow, a movement in the trees, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw what it was. A large figure, standing in the distance. My heart nearly stopped. I froze in place, unsure whether to move closer or run back to camp. The figure didn't move, but it was tall and unnaturally still. It almost looked like a person, but something about it felt wrong. Its posture, the way it loomed in the shadows. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my pulse racing, but eventually, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. I couldn't tell you how long I stood there, trying to make sense of what I saw. It wasn't human, but it wasn't like any animal I had ever seen either. Whatever it was large, and its movements were too calculated, too deliberate. I ran back to camp as fast as I could, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. I barely managed to get back into my tent, but the whole time I felt like someone, or something, was watching me from just beyond the light of the fire. My breathing was shallow, and I clutched my stick like it was the only thing that could protect me. The rest of the night passed in a blur of paranoia. When the sun finally rose, I was already awake, though I hadn't slept a wink. I tried to act normal around my friends, but I could tell they noticed something was off. They said nothing, but I could feel their eyes on me. I didn't say anything about what I had seen, either. I just wanted to get out of there. We packed up camp that morning, leaving no trace behind. The drive back to Boise was long, but the moment we hit the main road, I felt my body relax. The unease that had settled deep in my chest during the trip finally lifted. To this day, I still don't know what I saw in those woods, but I've never gone camping in that spot again. I can't explain the figure, the noises, or the feeling of being watched, but I've learned that some places aren't meant to be visited. Some experiences stay with you long after you've left, and I've never felt truly safe in the woods since. It was late August of 2019 when I decided I needed a break from everything. I was 27 years old back then, working a construction job in Dayton, Ohio. The long hours and the heavy work had worn me down to the bone. I wasn't married, didn't have any kids, and most of my friends had either moved away or gotten busy with families of their own. I figured it would do me some good to get out for a bit, reconnect with nature like I used to do when I was younger. Back then, my dad would take me fishing and camping all over the Midwest, and some of the best memories I had were from those trips. I didn't want to go to some popular, crowded campground packed with people in giant RVs. I wanted real peace and quiet, so I found this small, out-of-the-way place called Ironwood Hollow. It was a primitive campground out in southern Indiana, about 3.5 hours from where I lived. It was the kind of place where you had to pack in your own water, hike a ways to get to the sites, and dig your own fire pit if you wanted one. No cell service, no running water, no people. It sounded perfect. I spent the Friday before Labor Day weekend gathering my stuff. I packed my old Coleman tent, a sleeping bag rated down to 30 degrees just in case it got cold at night, my fishing rod, a hatchet, a hunting knife, 2 gallons of water, a couple days worth of food. Mostly jerky, trail mix, a few cans of beans, and some freeze-dried meals, and other basics like a flashlight, first aid kit, fire starter, and a small camp stove. I threw everything in the back of my 2005 Ford Ranger, made sure I had a full tank of gas, and headed out around 5 in the morning Saturday. The drive was easy. It was the kind of drive where the further you went, the less you saw of fast food places and gas stations, and the more you saw of cornfields and woods. The last hour of it was all winding, narrow county roads, most of them without lines painted on them, with the trees crowding close to the edge. Every now and then, I'd have to slow down for a deer or some wild turkey crossing. I got to the trailhead around 9:30. There was one other car there, an old Subaru Outback that looked like it had seen better days. It didn't bother me. The place was huge. I figured whoever it was would be far enough away that I wouldn't even know they were there. I loaded my backpack, slung my fishing rod over my shoulder, locked the truck, and started down the trail. It was cool out for late August, probably about 60 degrees, and the air was heavy with the smell of wet leaves and pine. The trail was muddy in places, but nothing too bad. After about 1.5 miles, I found a spot that looked perfect. It was a little clearing about 50 yards off the main trail, tucked behind a thick stand of fir trees. The ground was fairly flat, and there was a small, slow-moving creek a few yards away. Perfect for washing up and maybe even catching a fish or two if I got lucky. I set up the tent first, staked it down good and tight, then gathered some rocks and built a fire ring. I dug out a little pit for the fire, lined it with rocks, and set some dry twigs and branches inside. Once that was done, I laid out my sleeping bag inside the tent, got my little camp stove set up, and boiled some water for coffee. I spent most of that first day just wandering around the area. I followed the creek for a while, keeping an eye out for fish but didn't see much. It was shallow and rocky, mostly minnows darting around. I figured it didn't matter. I hadn't come for fishing. I was just happy to be out of the city, away from the noise and people. As the sun started going down, the woods around me changed. It got real still. Even the birds seemed to quiet down. It wasn't creepy, not really, just different. I got a good fire going, cooked up a freeze-dried beef stew meal that tasted a whole lot better than it looked, and sat there sipping on some coffee while the woods turned dark around me. That first night went by without anything weird happening. I slept fine, waking up once or twice to the sounds of raccoons rustling around outside the tent, but nothing alarming. I got up around 6 the next morning, made some instant oatmeal, packed up a little day pack with snacks and water, and decided to do some more exploring. There was a trail on my map that led up to a ridge overlooking the whole valley. It looked like about a 3-mile hike from where I was camped. I set off, following the little footpath. The forest was beautiful in the morning light, sunbeams cutting through the trees, mist hanging low over the creek. After about an hour, I noticed something that made me pause. There were tracks on the trail. Not boot prints, bare feet. They were small, like a kid's, but something about them looked off. The toes were too long, and the stride was strange, short and kind of uneven, like whoever made them had a limp. They were headed in the same direction I was going. I stood there for a long minute, just staring at them. It was strange, but I told myself it was probably just some local kid fooling around. Maybe a family was camping out here somewhere and one of their kids wandered off barefoot for whatever reason. It didn't make a lot of sense, but it didn't seem dangerous, so I kept going. The trail climbed steadily, and by the time I got to the ridge, I was sweating hard. I found a big flat rock at the top and sat down to catch my breath and have a snack. The view was incredible. Forest stretched out in every direction, endless green broken only by the glint of the creek winding through the valley. I sat there for a while, just soaking it in, then decided to head back down before it got too hot. The walk back was uneventful until I got close to my camp. That's when I noticed it. Something was wrong. From about 50 yards out, I could see my tent had been moved. Not collapsed, not destroyed, but shifted. Like someone had grabbed it and dragged it a couple feet to the side. My gear was scattered. My backpack was lying open. My food bag spilled out across the ground. I hurried over, heart pounding. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone. No sign of whoever or whatever had done it. Nothing was missing that I could tell, just thrown around. The weird thing was, my fishing rod, which I had left propped against a tree, was now lying across the fire pit, almost like it had been placed there on purpose. I picked everything up, checked over my supplies, and sat down to think. Animals could have done it, sure, but I didn't see any claw marks or teeth marks on anything, and an animal wouldn't move a tent. I told myself maybe it was the wind, though that didn't really explain it either. I hadn't seen another person since I got there, and it was a big area. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been at my camp while I was gone. I debated packing up and leaving, but pride got the better of me. I told myself I wasn't going to get scared off by some weird random thing. I fixed the camp back up, built the fire back up, cooked another meal, and tried to shake it off. That night, it was harder to sleep. Every little sound outside the tent made me jerk awake. I kept thinking about those footprints and the tent being moved. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something crunching in the leaves just outside. Heavy, deliberate steps. Not a deer, not a raccoon. Sounded too big. I grabbed the hunting knife I kept next to my sleeping bag and sat there, heart hammering in my chest, barely breathing. The steps circled the tent, slow and steady. I could hear breathing too, ragged, wet breathing, like whoever it was had trouble catching their breath. Then, just as slowly as they came, the steps moved off into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife clutched in my hand, staring at the tent walls, waiting for something else to happen. When the sky finally started to lighten, I got out of the tent. There were footprints all around. Bare feet again, but this time, they were smeared with mud and blood. Little streaks of red on the leaves and dirt. That was it for me. I wasn't gonna stick around to see what happened next. I tore down camp as fast as I could, stuffing everything into my pack without caring how it was packed. I left the fire pit as it was and took off down the trail, moving as fast as I could without running. The whole way back, I kept checking over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone, but I could hear things. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, like someone was following me just out of sight. When I got back to the parking area, my truck was still there, but the other car, the old Subaru, was gone. I didn't waste any time. I threw my stuff in the bed, locked the doors, and peeled out of there. I didn't really start to calm down until I hit the main road about 20 minutes later. Even then, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't go back to Ironwood Hollow. I didn't report it to the Park Service either. What would I have said? Some barefoot guy messed with my camp and breathed heavy outside my tent? They'd probably laugh me out of the office. But a few weeks later, I happened to mention the trip to a guy I worked with. He grew up around southern Indiana, knew a lot of the backwoods places. When I told him where I'd gone, his face got real serious. He told me that whole area had a history of wild men, feral people who lived off the land, people who had gone off the grid decades ago, living in the woods, avoiding contact with outsiders. Sometimes, he said, they didn't like people wandering into their territory. I never went camping alone after that. No matter how peaceful the woods look, you never really know who or what might be out there watching. It was late August 2012 when I decided to take a camping trip by myself. I was 29 then, feeling worn out from my construction job in Lexington, Kentucky. I needed a break from the constant noise of the city, the non-stop pressure from work. I didn't want to go somewhere popular where families and RVs crowded the sites. I wanted silence, real, full silence. I started searching for more remote places and found a little spot called Flat Rock River Reserve about 2 hours south. Not a lot of people talked about it online. A few grainy photos showed a winding river, dense woods, and rough dirt trails. It looked like the perfect spot to just disappear for a couple days and come back to life feeling new again. I packed light. I brought my old dark green tent, a heavy sleeping bag, a camping stove, a little cooler with meat and eggs, a jug of water, my hunting knife, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. I also brought my fishing pole since the river supposedly had some bass. I figured I'd catch dinner if I got lucky. The day I left, the sky was bright but hazy. It had that weird late summer heat where the air feels sticky even before noon. I loaded everything into my battered pickup and set out, windows rolled down, my arm hanging out. I didn't bother telling many people exactly where I was going. I just left a note on the counter in case something happened, saying I'd be back in 3 days. The drive took me through back roads I'd never seen before. Thin, cracked asphalt cut through endless cornfields and woods. Every so often, I passed a leaning barn or a boarded-up gas station. I remember thinking how empty everything felt, like everyone had just stood up and left. By the time I reached the turnoff for Flat Rock, it was almost 4 in the afternoon. The road turned into gravel, then just packed dirt. My tires kicked up dust so thick it looked like a storm behind me. Finally, after crawling along for what felt like forever, I found a little clearing right by the river. The trees were thick here, big old maples and oaks, trunks so wide I couldn't have wrapped my arms around them. Their branches hung low, blocking out a lot of the sun, making the ground dark even though it was still daytime. The river moved slow, almost lazy, but the banks were steep, about 8 feet high in most places. I got out, stretched my back until it popped, and looked around. No tire tracks but mine. No people. No noise except the low, constant rush of the river and the occasional call of a crow. I set up my tent about 15 yards from the edge of the river, close enough to hear it at night, but far enough I wouldn't worry about the ground getting soft if it rained. After getting the tent stakes pounded into the dirt, I threw my sleeping bag inside and set the cooler by the flap. As the light started to fade, I fired up my camping stove and cooked some scrambled eggs and sausage. I ate sitting on a fallen log, my back to the river, watching the woods get darker. The mosquitoes came out fast. I smeared on some repellent and zipped myself inside the tent just as the last bit of light faded from the sky. Inside, it was hot and stuffy. I stripped down to my boxers and lay there on top of my sleeping bag, flashlight off, letting my body adjust to the noises around me. Crickets chirped. Something splashed in the river now and then. A low owl hooted somewhere deeper in the woods. It took a while, but eventually, I drifted off into a restless sleep. I woke up once in the middle of the night. The air felt cooler, almost cold. The noises outside had changed. The normal night sounds were gone. No crickets, no frogs, just dead silence. I lay there staring at the roof of the tent, not moving. In the dead quiet, I could hear my heart beating, slow and heavy. I told myself it was nothing. Sometimes animals get quiet when a predator is nearby, maybe a fox or a coyote. I stayed still, barely breathing, until I finally drifted back off. The next morning, I woke up sweaty and stiff. The sun was already burning through the tent walls, making it feel like a sauna. I crawled out, stretched again, and set up my little fishing rod. After eating some jerky for breakfast, I climbed down the steep riverbank and found a decent spot to cast. The river here was shallow along the edges, maybe knee-deep, but it got darker and deeper closer to the middle. I stood on a muddy little patch of ground, fishing for a couple of hours, caught 2 small bass and tossed them back. Around noon, I decided to explore the woods a bit. I locked the cooler shut, grabbed my knife and a bottle of water, and headed out. I didn't go far at first, just sticking to the river, moving upstream. The ground was uneven, roots and old stumps everywhere. After about an hour of walking, I came across something strange. It was an old rusted-out car, half buried in a thicket of vines. The roof had caved in and the windows were gone. There was moss growing thick over the hood. Judging by the design, it looked like it had been there for decades. There weren't any trails around it, no signs of people, just this wreck sitting there like a forgotten skeleton. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a weird knot form in my gut. Something about it didn't sit right, like it shouldn't have been there at all. I kept moving after a while, brushing off the unease. But I noticed the woods getting thicker, harder to push through. The trees leaned in closer together, and the undergrowth got heavier. It started to feel wrong, like the woods didn't want me there. I decided to head back. The walk back seemed longer somehow. The river looked the same, but I felt turned around. I had to stop a couple times, just listening for the water to make sure I was going the right way. When I finally saw my tent again, I felt a wave of relief, but it didn't last long. There were tracks around the campsite. At first, I thought maybe they were mine, but they weren't. They were different, bigger, heavier. The dirt around my tent had deep impressions, spaced out farther than my stride. Some looked like boot prints, but the heels were worn down almost flat. My cooler had been moved, not opened, just shifted a couple feet to the side like someone had picked it up, maybe trying to open it, then set it down. My heart started pounding. I stood there frozen, scanning the woods. Nothing moved. I checked the cooler, everything was still there. I looked around for other signs. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just the prints. I spent the rest of the afternoon on edge, barely able to relax. I kept my knife close at all times. I cooked dinner early, ate fast, and doused the stove flame. I didn't light a fire that night. I didn't want to draw attention. As soon as it got dark, I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut tight, and lay there sweating in the heat, listening. The night stretched on forever. Every little snap of a twig outside made me jolt. Once, I thought I heard something heavy moving near the riverbank, a slow shuffling sound, but it faded away. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke with a jerk to the sound of something touching the tent. It was a soft brushing sound, like a hand dragging across the nylon. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My knife was under my sleeping bag, and I slid my hand toward it inch by inch. The brushing sound circled the tent slowly. I stayed frozen, waiting, listening. After a few minutes that felt like hours, the noise stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just lay there gripping the knife, staring into the darkness. When the first gray light of dawn finally bled through the tent walls, I sat up and unzipped the door, peeking out. The site looked normal, but the tracks were back. More of them now, circling the tent, coming right up to the flap. I packed up fast, shoving everything into the truck without bothering to organize it. I just wanted out of there. My hands shook as I worked. I kept glancing at the trees, waiting to see something, someone, step out. Nothing ever did. I climbed into the truck, fired it up, and peeled out of that clearing so fast I nearly fishtailed into the river. The drive back was a blur. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, and even then, I kept checking my mirrors like something might be following me. When I finally got home, I didn't even unpack. I went inside, locked the doors, and sat on the couch shaking for a long time. I never reported it. I never told anyone the full story, just said the place gave me a bad feeling. Looking back, I still don't know what was out there. Maybe a homeless person living off the land. Maybe a hunter who didn't like me being in their woods. Maybe something worse. All I know is I trusted my gut after that. I stopped camping alone. Flat Rock River Reserve faded from my mind over the years, but sometimes at night, when the house is real quiet, I'll get a sudden memory of that brushing sound against the tent, and every hair on my body stands up. Not everything dangerous makes noise. Sometimes it just waits, quiet and patient, in the dark. In the summer of 2018, I decided to take a break from everything and go camping alone for a few days. I had just turned 32, and after years of constant working, I felt like I needed to get away from the noise and pressure. I lived in Missoula, Montana at the time, and there was this huge national forest about 2 hours north that I had always wanted to explore, a place called McCarty Hollow. It wasn't one of those places that had campsites or marked trails. It was just a big, rough stretch of forest and mountains that a few locals sometimes hunted or fished in. I had spent the week before preparing. I bought all new camping gear, a heavy-duty tent, a better sleeping bag rated for colder nights, a small propane stove, a water filter pump, and a bigger backpack that could carry everything. I even bought a new survival knife and a strong headlamp with extra batteries. I didn't want to take any chances out there. I packed all my meals in vacuum-sealed bags and made sure to have a big can of bear spray and a loud air horn. Montana wasn't a joke when it came to bears, especially that deep into the woods. I left on a Wednesday morning, planning to stay out there until Sunday. My plan was simple: hike in about 6 or 7 miles, find a good place to camp near a stream, and spend my days fishing, hiking, and just relaxing. No phone, no emails, no noise. Just the trees, the air, and me. The drive up was beautiful. Rolling green hills, thick forests stretching out over the mountains, and clear blue skies. It was the middle of June, so the weather was warm, but not suffocating. I parked my truck at the edge of a rough logging road that led into the forest. There weren't any signs or gates, just a narrow gravel path disappearing into the trees. I threw my pack on, locked up the truck, and started walking. First, the trail was easy. The ground was dry and firm, and the trees offered a lot of shade. Birds chirped somewhere high up in the branches, and every once in a while, I saw a squirrel dart across the path. The smell of pine and dirt filled the air. Felt good to be out there, free somehow. After about 2 hours of hiking, the trail got rougher. The trees grew thicker, and the ground was uneven and rocky. I didn't mind, though. I liked the challenge. I kept an eye out for a good place to camp. I wanted to be near water, but I also wanted to be far enough away from it that animals wouldn't come sniffing around my tent at night. Finally, I found it. A small clearing just off a narrow stream that ran cold and clear over smooth rocks. The clearing was flat and dry, with a thick wall of trees around it. Felt private, tucked away. I set up my tent at the far end of the clearing, with the entrance facing the trees and my back to a steep rocky slope that led down to the stream. I figured it would be nice to listen to the water at night. By the time camp was set up, it was late afternoon. I boiled some water and made a packet of instant chili, then sat on a fallen log to eat. The world was still and peaceful. No hum of traffic, no neighbors talking, no music or TV in the background. Just the soft rush of the stream and the rustle of the wind in the trees. I slept like a rock that first night. The air was cool but not cold, and my sleeping bag was warm. I woke up only once, sometime in the middle of the night, to the sound of something moving through the brush nearby. My heart raced a little. It could have been a bear or a deer or anything. I lay perfectly still, listening. The sound faded after a few minutes, and eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I felt great. I pumped fresh water from the stream, made coffee on the little stove, and set out for a long hike. I didn't follow any real trail, I just kind of wandered. I had a compass and a GPS, and I marked my camp's location before I left, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. The forest was beautiful, dense, and alive. I saw a few deer, a couple of rabbits, and even a fox darting through the underbrush. I climbed up a low ridge and found a spot where the trees thinned out and I could see for miles. Rolling hills, deep green valleys, and in the distance, the blue outline of taller mountains. It was exactly what I had hoped for. I spent most of the day hiking and exploring, then headed back toward camp in the late afternoon. I was maybe half a mile away when I noticed something strange. The air felt different. It's hard to explain. It was still warm, but the smell was off. Not like pine or dirt, but something sour, almost metallic, like old blood. I thought maybe I had come across a dead animal. That wasn't unusual out here. I slowed down, looking around carefully. The forest was still, no birds, no squirrels, nothing. I kept walking, but slower now. I didn't want to stumble across a bear carcass or something and surprise a scavenger. The smell got stronger as I got closer to camp. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just bad. It was wrong. When I finally pushed through the last few trees into my clearing, my heart dropped. My camp was wrecked. The tent was slashed open in long, deep rips. My backpack had been torn apart, the contents scattered all over the ground. Food wrappers, clothes, my sleeping bag. Everything was shredded and strewn across the clearing. Even the metal frame of my camp stove was bent out of shape. I stood there, frozen, for a long time. My first thought was a bear. It had to be. Maybe it smelled the food and went crazy trying to get at it. But something didn't feel right about that. I had stored all my food properly, sealed in airtight bags and hung from a tree branch away from the tent. And bears didn't usually just destroy everything. They went for the food, ate what they wanted and left. This felt like anger, felt personal. I forced myself to move, to pick through the mess. My water filter was crushed. My spare batteries were scattered and missing. Even the bear spray was punctured and empty, its contents sprayed uselessly over the ground. It was clear I couldn't stay. I didn't even have a working tent anymore. I needed to get back to my truck. I stuffed what I could salvage into my ripped-up pack, slung it over my shoulder, and started back the way I had come. That's when I realized something even worse. I had marked my route with small piles of stones and broken sticks, subtle, but easy for me to recognize. Every single one of those markers was gone. At first, I thought maybe I had just missed them. Maybe I was turned around. But no matter how far I walked, nothing looked right. The trees were too thick. The ground was wrong. The stream should have been closer. I stopped, breathing hard, and checked my GPS. Dead. Completely dead. It wouldn't even turn on. I pulled out my compass. The needle spun slowly, aimlessly, like it was drunk. Panic started to rise in my chest. I had a rough idea of which direction the truck was in, but out here, a few wrong turns could mean getting lost for days. I told myself to stay calm. I picked a direction that felt right and started walking. The forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew closer together, the underbrush thicker. I pushed through brambles and ducked under low-hanging branches. The smell, that sour, metallic stink, came and went, sometimes so strong it made my eyes water, sometimes fading until I almost thought I imagined it. I don't know how long I walked. Hours, maybe. The sun was starting to dip low behind the trees, throwing long shadows across the ground. My legs were shaking from exhaustion. My hands were scratched and bleeding from pushing through the undergrowth. Just as the light started to fade completely, I stumbled onto something. A trail. Not a wide one, but a narrow footpath almost hidden under the weeds. It looked old, barely used. I didn't care. It was better than wandering blind. I turned onto it and followed it uphill, hoping it would lead somewhere. After about half an hour, the trail led me to the edge of a ravine. It wasn't huge, maybe 20 feet across and 30 feet deep, but the sides were steep and rocky. A small, muddy creek trickled through the bottom. Across the ravine, the trail picked up again, winding into the trees. There was no bridge, no fallen tree to cross on. I stood there, staring across at the trail. It was so close. If I could just get across, maybe I could find a road or a cabin or something. But the ravine was too wide to jump, and the sides were too steep to climb down and back up easily. I looked around for another way, but the forest was thick and darkening fast. I didn't want to leave the trail. I didn't trust myself to find it again. That's when I noticed something. Down the side of the ravine, about 10 feet below me, there was a narrow ledge. It wasn't wide, maybe a foot across, but it seemed to run along the ravine wall for a good distance. If I could climb down to it, I could maybe inch my way along to a spot where the ravine was narrower, then climb back up. It was risky. If I slipped, I could break a leg or worse. But staying put wasn't an option. Night was coming fast, and I wasn't about to camp out in the open with whatever had wrecked my gear. I slung my pack tight against my back, dropped to my stomach, and slowly started to slide down the slope. The dirt crumbled under me, and I slid faster than I wanted to, rocks tearing at my arms. I never thought I'd end up like this, stranded in the woods, alone, with nothing but the sound of rustling leaves and my own breathing to keep me company. It all started innocently enough, just a weekend camping trip with my brother and a couple of friends. We had been planning this trip for months, excited to get away from the noise of the city, the stress of work, and just enjoy nature for a while. But as often happens, things didn't go according to plan. It was the first weekend of September. The weather was perfect, not too hot, not too cold, and the leaves were just beginning to turn colors, giving the woods a golden glow. My brother, Alex, had found this secluded campsite just outside of Fort Wayne, Indiana. He swore by it, saying it was the perfect spot for a quiet retreat, far from the crowds and distractions of other campers. We arrived Friday afternoon, loaded up with all the gear we could possibly need. Tents, sleeping bags, a portable grill, coolers filled with food and drinks. We had everything, or so we thought. It took us a while to find the site. It was deep in the woods, the dirt roads twisting and turning through thick trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. It wasn't the easiest drive, but we were in no rush, enjoying the peace of the forest and the quiet of the roads. By the time we set up our camp, it was getting late, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The site itself was pretty perfect. A large clearing surrounded by tall pines and oaks, the ground soft with moss, and a small stream that ran nearby, its gentle gurgling adding to the calm atmosphere. We set up the tents in a circle around the fire pit, started a small fire, and began cooking dinner. The air was crisp, and everything seemed so peaceful. That night, we stayed up late, talking and laughing around the fire. The sounds of the forest surrounded us, but they didn't feel threatening. Just the usual rustling of animals, the occasional call of an owl, the wind through the trees. I remember feeling calm, relaxed, maybe a little too comfortable, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. The temperature had dropped, and the fire wasn't enough to keep us warm anymore. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and lay there for a while, listening to the crackling of the fire and the occasional wind gust. Slowly, I drifted off to sleep. The first strange night. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me, just the usual shift from a deep sleep to a lighter one. But then I heard something outside my tent, a faint sound, like a twig snapping or something brushing against the canvas. I lay still for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal moving through the woods. But then I heard it again, this time closer. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. They were heavy, the crunch of the ground unmistakable. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The footsteps circled the camp, moving from one side to the other, always staying just out of sight, like someone was walking just beyond the reach of the firelight. My heart started pounding. I didn't know if I should wake Alex or anyone else. What if it was just an animal? What if it was something else? I waited, hoping it would pass, but the footsteps kept coming. They seemed to draw closer to my tent, stopping just outside, so close I could feel the presence there. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear any breathing, just the sound of something or someone waiting. The silence stretched on. A minute passed, then two, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal moving through the camp. But no animal would move like this, so slowly, deliberately, stopping to wait like that. I didn't want to be the one to find out what it was. I lay there frozen, willing myself not to make a sound. I listened carefully. The footsteps resumed, moving away from my tent this time, back toward the trees. But something felt wrong. It didn't feel like an animal. It felt like something that knew we were there, watching us, waiting for something. When the footsteps faded completely into the distance, I finally exhaled, my lungs aching from holding my breath for so long. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just an animal. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Sleep didn't come easily after that. I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening to every little sound, every crackling twig, every gust of wind. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into an uneasy slumber. The morning after, when the sun rose, it was as if everything had returned to normal. The sky was clear, the birds were chirping, and the forest seemed peaceful again. I crawled out of my tent and stretched, trying to shake off the unease from the night. Alex was already up, tending to the fire, and the others were stirring in their tents. No one else had heard the footsteps, or if they had, they didn't mention it. I didn't say anything either. I wasn't sure if I should. Could have been nothing. But deep down, I felt like I had been watched, like something had been lurking just outside the camp, waiting for something. We spent the day hiking around the area, exploring the woods and relaxing by the stream. It was beautiful out, and the events of the night before seemed to fade into the background. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest felt too quiet at times, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something. By evening, we were all back at camp, gathered around the fire again. Alex was flipping burgers on the grill, and the others were talking and laughing. I tried to enjoy the moment, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange footsteps, the unsettling feeling that had followed me all day. The second night, that night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, the sound of the forest seemed louder. The wind was picking up, and the leaves rustled against the tent walls. I tried to focus on the sounds, tell myself they were just the normal noises of the woods, but it didn't help. My mind was too alert, too tense. Couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump. I turned over, eyes wide open, staring at the dark ceiling of my tent. Outside, the wind howled, and the trees creaked. But in the stillness of my tent, there was a quiet, almost imperceptible sound. A faint thud. The same sound I had heard the night before. My heart skipped a beat. It was the same sound, the same rhythm. Footsteps. This time I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled out of my tent, careful not to make a sound. I moved silently toward the fire pit, my eyes scanning the trees, the darkness beyond. But I saw nothing. No movement. No figures in the shadows. Just the dark, quiet forest. The footsteps stopped when I stood up, and the whole camp seemed to hold its breath. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I wake everyone? Should I leave? But something told me not to do anything. Not yet. The woods had a way of making you feel small, insignificant, like you were just one tiny piece in the grand scheme of things. I returned to my tent, my heart racing, and lay there listening, waiting. But there was nothing more. The night passed without incident, and by morning, everything seemed normal again, or at least as normal as it could be. The decision to leave. The third day dawned clear and cold. We packed up our gear and got ready to leave, the fire still smoldering in the pit. It was a relief to finally be heading out, even though I didn't say anything to the others. I wasn't sure how to explain what had happened without sounding paranoid. As we drove away from the camp, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following us in the rearview mirror. But the road was empty, the trees silent. It wasn't until we were miles down the road, the camp far behind us, that I finally felt like I could breathe again. I never did figure out what caused those footsteps. Maybe it was a hunter, or maybe it was just my imagination. But something told me I'd never return to that spot, not after what I'd experienced. As the landscape passed by, I realized that sometimes the woods can hold more than just trees and animals. They can hold things you're better off not understanding. I had been planning this camping trip for months. Ever since I'd gotten the time off work, I was determined to escape the noise of the city, disconnect from everything, and find some peace in the outdoors. It wasn't that I hated the hustle of life or that I had any deep-seated need for a spiritual awakening in the woods. It was simply the fact that I needed a break from the stress. That, and I loved camping. I've been camping before, lots of times, actually. Nothing particularly extraordinary ever happened. Just the usual nights by the campfire, stories with friends, the distant howls of coyotes, and the occasional bear sighting. At least that's what we thought it was. This time, however, I was on my own. It was the last weekend of September in 2024. The leaves had just started to turn. The mornings were crisp, and the daylight was starting to wane sooner than I was used to. I had rented a secluded spot at the East Fork Campground, a place nestled deep in the woods of the Appalachian Mountains, about an hour outside of Asheville, North Carolina. I wasn't sure if it was the remote location or the stillness of the air that made the place feel different, but there was something about the area that made my skin crawl just a little. It was hard to describe. Maybe it was the endless quiet, or maybe it was just the wild terrain, but I tried not to think about it. After all, it was just a campground. No reason to get paranoid. I arrived mid-afternoon on a Thursday, my backpack full of supplies, camping gear packed neatly in the back of my truck. The leaves rustled as I made my way to the camp, the wind picking up a little and sending the scent of pine needles and earth into the air. I set up camp quickly. The space I'd been assigned was nestled in between a few towering oak trees. I had a small fire pit, a wooden bench, and a picnic table in front of me. The tent went up without much trouble, and soon enough, I had my camp arranged just how I liked it. Once I was settled, I started to wander around, exploring the immediate surroundings. The campground was surrounded by thick woods, with a narrow creek running along the edge of the property. I walked down to the creek, trying to quiet the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Everything felt still, but not in the peaceful, comforting way that I'd hoped. No birds chirped, no squirrels rustled in the leaves, no wind brushed the tree branches above. It was unsettling. The creek, however, was peaceful enough, gently flowing over smooth stones. I stood there for a while, just listening to the sound of water flowing, until I noticed the sky beginning to darken. By the time I made it back to the camp, it was already evening, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. I built a small fire and set up a simple dinner. As I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. After all, I was in the woods, and it's easy to feel small and vulnerable in nature. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Every time I looked up from my meal, the feeling intensified. I couldn't pinpoint the source. It wasn't an animal, I was sure of that. It felt human, almost like there was someone standing just out of my line of sight, waiting. I shook it off. The sun set fully, and the fire crackled in front of me, casting long shadows on the ground. The last traces of daylight disappeared behind the trees, and the temperature dropped even further. I felt a chill in the air. Maybe it was just the woods. After all, it was getting late, and it was a wilderness campground. There were bound to be other campers nearby. The silence around me was just the absence of civilization. I went to bed early that night, hoping to shake off the uneasy feeling. It wasn't like I was afraid. I was just unsettled, and maybe a little paranoid. But I lay there in the dark, in my sleeping bag, trying to sleep. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours. It wasn't until the middle of the night that I heard it, the rustling of leaves. I sat up quickly, heart racing, straining to hear. It wasn't a breeze. The rustling was deliberate, slow, methodical. Someone was moving through the trees, just outside my tent. I reached for the flashlight and shined it through the thin material of the tent, but I saw nothing. My breath caught in my chest. It was too quiet now. No more sounds of wildlife, just the distant rustling, growing louder. Whoever or whatever was out there knew I was awake. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the entrance of the tent, listening to the faint noise outside. Time felt like it had frozen, the air thick with tension. Every part of my body screamed at me to stay silent, to remain as still as possible. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rustling stopped. The woods fell completely silent again. I waited for a long time, unsure of whether I should check outside or just stay where I was. I could have sworn I heard footsteps, but there was no sound now. I thought maybe it had been an animal, maybe a raccoon or deer, but something about the silence that followed didn't sit right. I kept my eyes on the tent entrance, hoping that whatever it was had moved on. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was out there, watching. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight, slid out of my sleeping bag, and unzipped the tent. I stepped outside, shining the light around the camp. The glow of the flashlight illuminated the trees, casting long, eerie shadows. Nothing moved. Nothing was there. The fire had burned down to embers, and the whole campsite felt still, almost like a forgotten place. My nerves were on edge. I scanned the trees around me, looking for any sign of movement, but the woods were dark and uninviting. I walked around the campsite, checking the perimeter. No signs of anyone nearby, just the cold, silent trees. I went back to my tent and spent the rest of the night trying to sleep, though it was impossible. Every creak, every snap of a twig, made me sit up, holding my breath, hoping it wasn't what I thought it was. Morning finally came, but it didn't bring any comfort. I packed up my gear and left the campsite as quickly as I could. It wasn't until I was driving down the mountain, the woods behind me, that I felt like I could breathe again. Looking back, I still don't know who or what was out there, but I'm convinced now that the woods hold more than just trees and animals. There's something about them, something ancient, that makes you feel as though you're not as alone as you think. I still love camping. I still go out into the wilderness when I get the chance. But after that night, I don't take the woods for granted anymore. The wilderness has a way of reminding you that it's not a place to be taken lightly. And sometimes the most unsettling thing of all is how much we don't know about it. My name's Adam Carter. I'm 33 now, but back when this happened, I was 26. It was late September of 2017. I was living in central Montana back then, working a job I didn't care about, just trying to figure out what to do with my life. I used to camp a lot during that time. It was the one thing that gave me real peace. Packing up a tent, a sleeping bag, a little stove, a cooler of food, and disappearing into the woods for a few days always seemed to reset my brain. I wasn't scared of being alone. In fact, I preferred it most of the time. The quiet, the stillness, the feeling of being cut off from everything. It was good for me. That September, the weather had been mild and dry. Daytime highs in the 70s, nights cool but not freezing. It was perfect camping weather. I'd been reading about a place called Broken Rock Preserve. It was about a 4-hour drive north of where I lived, tucked way off the highway, known for these strange cliff formations and deep ravines. Not many people went out there, which made it even more appealing. I decided to take a long weekend and head up Friday morning. I didn't even tell anybody exactly where I was going. I just mentioned to my buddy Mark I'd be camping up north for a few days and would be back Sunday night. That was normal for me. Nobody thought anything of it. I packed up my old red Tacoma the night before. Tent, sleeping pad, heavy sleeping bag, propane stove, canned food, 2 gallons of water, hatchet, folding chair, flashlight, lantern, extra batteries, bear spray, a fixed blade knife, basic first aid kit, and a pair of hiking boots. Everything had its place in the bed of the truck. I filled the gas tank full and checked the tire pressure. I even bought a new pair of hiking socks. I had no reason to think this trip would be any different than the dozens of others I'd taken. Friday morning, I was on the road by 6:30. The sun was just coming up over the hills, painting everything in gold and pink. I stopped for gas and coffee at a little town called Madison Junction, then took the county road north out of town, following the directions I'd printed off because there was no way my phone was going to have service once I got out there. The last hour of the drive was on gravel roads. Dust kicked up behind my truck in thick clouds. I passed a few ranches, a handful of cattle standing behind barbed wire fences, and then nothing. Just open land, scrubby grass, scattered pine trees, and rocky hills. I passed a faded wooden sign that said Broken Rock Preserve, nailed to a fence post. No gates, no rangers, no check-ins. Just wide open land and dirt tracks leading off into the hills. I followed the rough path another half-mile until it ended at a clearing surrounded by trees. A worn-out fire ring sat in the middle, a few old logs placed around it like benches. There was no one else around. I killed the engine and just sat there for a minute, listening. The silence was huge. I could hear my own heartbeat, the ticking of the cooling engine, the faint whisper of the wind through the grass. I climbed out, stretched, and started setting up camp. Tent first, staked down tight because I knew the wind could pick up out here. Sleeping pad and bag inside. Chair unfolded by the fire pit. I cracked open a can of beans, ate cold straight from the can, and drank half a bottle of water. Then I laced up my boots and decided to do some exploring. There was a narrow trail leading off from the clearing, worn into the grass by the hooves of deer or maybe the boots of a few hikers. I followed it, heading toward the cliffs I could see in the distance. They were strange-looking, huge slabs of gray stone tilted up at weird angles, like someone had tried to build a wall and given up halfway through. The hike was easy at first, flat, open. Then the ground started to dip and rise in long, shallow waves. I passed a dry creek bed, cracked mud, and scattered rocks. I found a twisted old tree that had been hit by lightning long ago, blackened and dead but still standing. As I got closer to the cliffs, the land got rougher. Deep gullies cut through the ground, forcing me to zigzag back and forth. The cliffs themselves towered above me, the rock faces pitted and scarred like giant teeth. It was beautiful in a raw, lonely way. I spent a couple hours out there, just wandering. I saw deer tracks, scat from what I thought was probably coyotes, and once, far off, a lone antelope standing motionless on a ridge, watching me. When the sun started to drop lower in the sky, I turned back. I didn't want to try finding my way across this uneven ground in the dark. I made it back to camp just as the sky turned orange. I built a small fire, cooked a can of soup on the stove, and sat back to watch the stars come out. They were incredible, no light pollution, just millions of cold white points across a black sky. I stayed up for a while, feeding the fire, sipping water, thinking about nothing. Then I put out the fire carefully, made sure all the embers were dead, and climbed into my tent. The first night was fine, cold but not too bad. I woke up once around 2 a.m. because something was moving outside the tent. I heard the crunch of grass and dry twigs. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was just deer. Probably a raccoon, maybe a coyote at worst. I stayed still, listened for a while, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. It was cold enough that my breath made little clouds in the tent. I pulled on my boots, unzipped the tent, and stood up. Everything looked normal. No signs of animals around the camp. I cooked a quick breakfast, packed a day pack with water and a few snacks, and headed back toward the cliffs. I wanted to explore deeper today, see if I could find any cool rock formations or maybe even caves. I liked the idea of discovering something out there that hardly anyone else had seen. The sun climbed higher, warming the air fast. I walked for miles, weaving through the gullies and rocky outcrops. I found a small cave, more like an overhang, and sat there for a while, eating a granola bar, drinking water, watching the land stretch out in every direction. Felt like being on another planet. After a while, I got restless and pushed on. Around noon, I climbed up a steep rocky slope, using my hands sometimes to steady myself. At the top, the ground flattened into a wide plateau. The view was incredible. Broken rocks scattered everywhere, deep cracks running through the earth, tufts of dry grass waving in the breeze. I noticed something weird up ahead. A line of old wooden posts stuck into the ground, spaced evenly apart. No wires between them, just posts, some broken or leaning, running in a crooked line toward the edge of the plateau. Curious, I followed them. They led me to a sharp drop-off, a kind of natural pit about 30 feet across. It looked almost like a sinkhole, except the sides were rough, layered rock, and it wasn't perfectly round. More like a jagged crack that had widened over time. I got close to the edge and looked down. It wasn't super deep, maybe 20 feet, but the bottom was full of broken rocks, dead branches, and something else. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but when I squinted, I realized it was the rusted-out frame of an old pickup truck lying on its side, half buried in debris. It must have gone off the edge decades ago. No way to tell how or why. Something about it made my skin crawl. Not because it was spooky or anything, just because it reminded me how easy it would be to get hurt or killed out here. If I slipped and fell, there'd be nobody to help me. Nobody even knew exactly where I was. I backed away from the edge carefully and decided it was time to head back. I didn't like the feeling that was starting to creep over me. That sense of being too small, too vulnerable in such a huge, empty place. The hike back took longer than I expected. The sun was starting to drop by the time I saw the clearing through the trees. I was sweaty, thirsty, and my legs ached from climbing. I was looking forward to a hot meal and an early night. But as soon as I stepped into the clearing, I knew something was wrong. The tent looked off, sagging slightly, the flap open, even though I knew I had zipped it closed. My chair was tipped over on its side. The cooler was a few feet away from where I'd left it. The lid cracked open. At first, I thought maybe an animal had gotten into my stuff. A bear, maybe, but there were no claw marks, no tracks, nothing torn apart, just disorder, like somebody had been pawing through things, then stopped halfway. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I pulled the knife from my belt and circled the camp slowly, scanning the trees, listening hard. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything except the wind. After a while, I forced myself to walk back to the tent. I checked my gear. My sleeping bag was still there. So was my stove, my lantern, my clothes. Nothing seemed to be missing, just messed with. It didn't make sense. Why would an animal move the cooler but not tear it open? Why would a person come all the way out here just to poke around and not steal anything? I couldn't explain it. I rebuilt the fire, cooked dinner fast, barely tasting it. I kept the knife close at hand, my head on a swivel. As soon as it got dark, Back in the summer of 2018, I decided I needed a break from the usual noise and busyness of life. I was 27 back then, living in a small town in southern Montana, working long hours in construction. I was always tired, my back ached all the time, and it felt like months since I had really breathed clean air. I remembered how my dad used to take me camping when I was a kid, and I figured a few days alone in the woods might be the best way to reset. I picked a spot that wasn't too popular, a place called North Elk Trail, about 4 hours away from where I lived. I didn't want crowded campgrounds with RVs and kids screaming. I wanted real quiet. I found a spot online that said it had old trails, thick woods, and a small river for fishing. Hardly anyone ever went there anymore because the official campsites had been closed down a few years back when the funding got cut. That sounded perfect to me. I packed up everything I thought I'd need: a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, a little propane stove, a cooler packed with simple food like canned beans, beef jerky, oatmeal, some coffee, and a few beers. I brought a big jug of water, my fishing rod, a hatchet, my old hunting knife, and a beat-up backpack. I made sure to throw in a first aid kit too, even though I wasn't planning to do anything too risky. I tossed my gear into my dusty blue pickup and hit the road early on a Thursday morning. The drive was easy enough at first. Wide open roads, the windows down, the smell of warm dry grass blowing through the cab. I had some old rock music playing low. Once I turned off onto the smaller back roads, the pavement disappeared, and I found myself driving along bumpy dirt trails winding deeper and deeper into the forest. I hardly saw another car for over an hour. At some points, the trees grew so thick that the sun barely touched the ground. I started to get that tight feeling in my chest that happens sometimes when you're excited but a little nervous too. When I finally reached the place I had marked on my paper map, I pulled over onto a patch of flattened dirt that must have been a parking spot once. A rusty metal post stuck out of the ground nearby, its sign so worn away I couldn't read a single letter. I cut the engine and sat there for a minute, listening. It was so quiet it felt heavy, like a big blanket had been dropped over the whole world. No car engines, no voices, just the faint whisper of leaves and the occasional buzz of a cicada. I got out and stretched my back until it cracked. The ground was dry and hard under my boots, covered in patches of yellow grass and old brown needles from the towering pines around me. After double-checking my gear, I slung my backpack over one shoulder and locked the truck. I figured I'd hike in about a mile or so, far enough from the trail to feel really alone. I wanted the kind of quiet you can only get way out where people stop coming. The trail was barely visible, just a thin, worn path cutting through the woods. Branches hung low overhead, and every few steps, I had to duck or push them aside. My boots crunched over loose stones and dry twigs. Sweat started to bead on my forehead after just a few minutes, even though it wasn't that hot. Maybe 70 degrees or so. It was more from carrying all the weight. I passed a few signs that this place used to be more alive. A collapsed wooden bridge over a dry gully. A fire ring filled with old, rusted beer cans. Once I even saw what looked like the remains of a trail marker, just a splintered post leaning at a crooked angle, half swallowed by the earth. I kept walking until the trail thinned out so much that I figured no one had been back there in years. That's where I decided to set up camp. There was a small clearing just off the trail, a flat patch of ground about 20 feet wide, ringed by tall trees. The sunlight slanted through the branches, painting gold stripes across the ground. A little ways off, I could hear the faint trickle of water, probably the river I'd read about. I dropped my pack and stood there for a moment, breathing in deep, It smelled like pine sap, old bark, and something else. Something faint and earthy, like damp moss. I started setting up the tent, driving the stakes deep into the ground and pulling the rainfly tight even though there weren't any clouds. I knew mountain weather could turn quick. Once the tent was up, I laid out my sleeping bag inside, then built a little fire ring out of stones and gathered enough wood to get a fire going that night. I took my fishing rod and a small tackle box and wandered down toward the sound of the river. It wasn't far, maybe a 2-minute walk through the trees. The river was narrow and clear, cutting through the woods like a silver ribbon. Small fish darted through the water, and the banks were covered in smooth stones and patches of moss. I sat on a rock and cast my line out, letting the bait float lazily downstream. The afternoon passed slow and quiet. I caught 2 small trout and decided that would be enough. I cleaned them right there on the bank, tossing the guts far into the bushes so they wouldn't attract animals to my camp. I hiked back up to the clearing, cooked the fish over my little propane stove, and ate sitting by the fire as the light slowly drained out of the sky. When it finally got dark, it got really dark. The kind of black that feels like it has weight. The fire crackled low, throwing jumping shadows across the trees. I stayed up for a while, staring into the flames, sipping one of my beers, and letting my mind wander. I thought about work, about old friends I hadn't seen in years, about how weird it was to be so alone. Around midnight, I put out the fire, zipped up the tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. It was quiet except for the soft gurgle of the river in the distance and the occasional hoot of an owl. That first night passed without anything strange. I slept hard and woke up to bright sunlight streaming through the tent. After a quick breakfast of oatmeal and instant coffee, I decided to hike around and explore a little. I didn't plan to go too far, just wanted to stretch my legs. I took only a small pack with some water, a snack, my knife, and a whistle just in case. I followed the river upstream, pushing through dense thickets of underbrush. The farther I went, the less like a trail it felt. Trees grew closer together, their roots snarling across the ground like twisted ropes. I climbed over fallen logs slick with moss and scrambled up steep banks where the river carved deep into the earth. At one point, I found what looked like another old campsite. Just a few blackened stones and the remains of a rotting log someone had probably used as a seat. There were no footprints, no fresh trash, nothing to show anyone had been there in years. I should have turned back then, but something made me keep going. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself I wasn't scared. The ground got steeper, the trees thicker. My boots slipped on loose gravel, and once I nearly lost my footing and tumbled down the bank. My heart pounded hard for a few minutes after that, but I shook it off. Eventually, I realized I couldn't hear the river anymore. I stopped walking and listened hard. Just the whisper of the wind in the trees. No water, no birds, nothing. The woods around me felt different, heavier. Still, I decided to head back. I turned around, and that's when I realized I didn't know exactly which way I'd come from. At first, I thought no big deal. I had the sun for direction, and I knew the river was somewhere downhill. I started walking downhill, figuring I'd find the water and follow it back. But the woods didn't seem right. Every tree looked the same. I walked for what felt like an hour without hearing the river. My mouth started to dry out, and I took a few sips from my water bottle. My hands were sweating even though the air was cool. I climbed a ridge to try to get a better view, but all I saw were endless trees stretching in every direction. No clearings, no river, no trail. I tried not to panic. I told myself to stay calm, to keep walking downhill. Gravity meant the river had to be lower than me. Another hour passed. My legs started to ache. The underbrush tore at my jeans and scratched my arms. I kept stumbling, kept tripping over hidden roots. I started yelling out sometimes, even though I knew no one was around to hear. By late afternoon, my water was almost gone. I hadn't eaten anything since morning, and my stomach felt tight and hollow. I had to sit down and catch my breath. That's when I noticed something. There were scratches on a tree nearby, deep grooves in the bark, about waist high. I stood up and looked closer. They weren't from an animal. They were too straight, too clean, almost like someone had cut into the tree with a knife. For a second, I felt relief. Maybe it was a marker from an old trail. Maybe I wasn't as lost as I thought. I followed the marks, moving slowly, careful not to trip. Every 20 feet or so, another tree had a similar scratch. It wasn't a clear path, but it was something. The sun was sinking lower, throwing long shadows through the woods, when I finally saw something through the trees up ahead. It was a cabin. A small, beat-up old cabin tucked into a low dip in the land, almost hidden by the forest. Its roof sagged in the middle, and the walls were dark with age and rot. There were no windows, just two empty frames with shards of glass clinging to the edges. The door hung crooked on its hinges. It didn't look like anyone had been there in a long time. Still, it was sheltered. My name is Mark Reed. I'm from a small town in southern Missouri, about 30 miles outside of Springfield. Back in 2016, when I was 34, I decided to take a solo camping trip up north into Idaho. I had a little window of time off work, and my wife had just taken the kids down to her parents' place in Texas for a week. I didn't feel like sitting around the empty house, so I packed up my old Ford F-150, loaded the bed with a cheap tent, a sleeping bag, a cooler full of food and water, and some basic gear, and headed out alone. I chose a place called Timber Creek, a small river that ran through the Salmon Chalice National Forest. I had read about it online a while back. It was supposed to be remote, rugged, and rarely visited compared to the bigger campgrounds. No official campsites, no bathrooms, no electric hookups. Just raw forest, rocky hills, and cold water. I drove for about 14 hours straight, only stopping for gas and a burger. By the time I pulled off the paved road onto a gravel Forest Service trail that led deeper into the trees, it was already evening. The sun was heavy and orange behind the mountains, and the shadows across the trail looked long and heavy. My tires crunched over the gravel as I crept along, windows down, smelling the sharp, clean pine smell that only the high country has. The forest road was rough, narrow, and mostly abandoned. Grass grew up in the middle, and tree branches clawed at the sides of my truck as I pushed deeper. After about 5 miles, the trail ended at a shallow, rocky spot along Timber Creek. I killed the engine and just sat for a minute, listening to the sound of the water running fast over the rocks. It felt good to be away from everything. No cell phone reception, no traffic, no neighbor's dog barking. I got out, stretched my legs, and started setting up camp about 20 yards from the water under a stand of big, twisted lodgepole pines. I laid out the tent, hammered the stakes into the dry, dusty ground, and gathered some wood for a fire. It felt good to work with my hands after being stuck in an office for months. That first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire until it burned down to embers, eating cold ham sandwiches and sipping a cheap beer from the cooler. The stars were incredible. I had forgotten how big the sky could look when you got far enough away from town. I slept like a rock, only waking once or twice to the distant yipping of coyotes somewhere up in the hills. The next morning, I was up early. The creek was misty, and the air was crisp enough that I could see my breath. I made a little instant coffee on my camp stove, ate a granola bar, and decided to do some hiking. My plan was simple. Follow the creek upstream for a few miles, maybe find a good fishing hole or just enjoy the scenery. I packed light, just a small backpack with water, some jerky, a first aid kit, and a knife. I left a bright orange bandana tied to a tree at my camp just in case, and I set off. The first part of the hike was easy. There were faint game trails along the creek made by deer or elk, and the ground was soft and forgiving underfoot. I saw fresh tracks here and there, and once I even startled a big jackrabbit that bounded off through the underbrush. As I went farther upstream, though, the terrain got rougher. The hills steepened sharply, and the pines grew tighter together. The creek cut through a narrow rocky gorge, and I had to scramble up and down boulders, sometimes getting my boots wet when I slipped too close to the water. I kept pushing on, stubbornly wanting to see what was around the next bend. After about 2 hours, I found a spot where the creek forked. One branch kept winding uphill, but the other veered sharply into a narrow canyon with steep rock walls. I figured the uphill fork looked easier, so I went that way, following a faint path worn into the grass. I kept climbing for another hour, and I was starting to get tired. The sun was higher now, and it was hot when I got out of the shade. The bugs were getting worse too. Tiny gnats that buzzed in my ears and bit at my neck. Eventually, I came to a high, rocky ridge overlooking the whole creek valley. I stopped to catch my breath and take it in. It was beautiful. The creek glittered way below, threading through a carpet of green trees and gray rocks. I could just barely see the corner of my white truck down at the campsite. It looked tiny from up here. I sat down on a flat rock and dug out some jerky from my pack, chewing slowly and drinking water. I figured I'd rest a bit before heading back. That's when I first noticed something strange. From where I sat, I could see another trail, narrower and less obvious, branching off from the ridge and heading deeper into the woods. It looked barely used, almost swallowed up by grass and shrubs. For some reason, it unsettled me a little. Maybe it was just how hidden it was, or the way the trees over there seemed darker, thicker. I told myself not to be a chicken. I wasn't a city kid. I'd hunted deer plenty of times growing up. I wasn't scared of the woods. So after resting a bit more, I decided to check it out. The trail was rough, and it wasn't long before it started sloping down again, winding through the trees in tight, twisting turns. The farther I went, the quieter everything got. I realized I hadn't heard a bird chirp or a squirrel chatter in a while. The only sound was my boots crunching on dry needles and the occasional creak of a tree swaying. I don't know how long I followed that path. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe longer. The trees got thicker and the light dimmer. The ground was soft and spongy, littered with pine needles and old fallen branches. Then the trail just ended. It stopped at a small clearing, maybe 20 feet across. In the center of the clearing was an old, half-collapsed shack. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The roof was sagging inward, covered in moss and dead leaves. One wall had completely fallen down. The door, hanging crooked on one rusted hinge, swung a little in the faint breeze. The place gave me a bad feeling the second I saw it. My skin crawled. I stood there for a minute, debating whether to get closer. Curiosity won out. I edged toward the shack carefully, stepping over piles of dead branches. Up close, I could see that it had been built from rough-cut logs, probably hand-hewn. Whoever had made it hadn't used nails, just wooden pegs and rope bindings now rotted away. Inside, the shack was empty except for an old iron stove tipped over in the corner, a broken wooden chair, and what looked like the remains of a cot. The floor was dirt, with scraps of cloth and bits of broken glass scattered around. I didn't stay long. The place felt wrong, like it didn't want me there. I turned around and started back toward the trail. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints, fresh ones, leading from the trail to the shack. But they weren't mine. They were bigger, wider, deeper too, like whoever made them was carrying something heavy or just weighed a lot more than me. The prints circled the shack a few times, then disappeared into the woods on the far side of the clearing. I hadn't seen or heard anyone all day, and these prints weren't old. They were crisp, sharp-edged, not softened by rain or wind. I felt exposed standing there, like something was watching me. I didn't run, but I didn't waste any time either. I headed back up the trail fast, trying to stay quiet but moving as quickly as I could without twisting an ankle. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something coming after me. I didn't, but the feeling didn't go away. It took me a lot longer to get back to the ridge than it had to come down. My legs were tired, and the ground seemed rougher, steeper than before. I slipped twice, scraping my palms on rocks. I barely noticed. All I could think about was getting back to my truck. When I finally reached the ridge, I looked down at my campsite and my stomach dropped. There was someone down there. A figure was standing by my tent, half bent over, like they were rummaging through my gear. Even from that distance, I could tell it wasn't just some passing hiker. The person was big, broad-shouldered, moving with this weird, deliberate slowness, like they weren't worried about being seen. I ducked behind a boulder and watched. The figure rifled through my cooler, dumped out my clothes bag, and then slowly stood up. They turned in a slow circle, looking around. Then they picked something up, my hatchet, and just walked off into the trees like they had all the time in the world. I stayed behind the rock, heart hammering, until I couldn't see them anymore. Then I waited longer, maybe 15 minutes, maybe more, before I dared move. When I finally crept back down toward the camp, everything felt wrong. The air was too still. The forest seemed too quiet. My tent was slashed open down one side. My sleeping bag was shredded, and my food was scattered all over the ground. I knew I had to leave. I didn't even think about staying the night. I tossed what little I could salvage into the truck bed, mostly just my backpack and a few cans of food, and jumped into the cab. I locked the doors, fired up the engine, and peeled out, throwing gravel behind me. The forest road was worse going out. I hit every pothole and washout too fast, jarring my teeth and scraping the truck's undercarriage. I didn't care. I just wanted out. When I finally hit the paved road again, I didn't stop driving. I still think about that weekend sometimes, usually when I'm driving alone at night and the road stretches too far ahead of me, too empty and too dark. It was early fall 2019. I had just turned 30, feeling a little restless with life, and decided I needed to get away for a few days. No responsibilities, no phones, no emails. I lived in a small town called Maysville in southern Ohio, and it didn't take much effort to find places where you could disappear for a little while. I loaded up my old beat-up green Chevy Tahoe with my tent, my sleeping bag, a few changes of clothes, enough food and water for 3 days, a camping stove, and a cooler filled with sandwich stuff and a few beers. I didn't tell many people where I was going, mostly because I didn't think it mattered. I was heading to a state forest about 2 hours south, Jackson Hill Forest. It was a quiet place, hundreds of acres of deep woods with hardly any official trails. Just scattered camping spots here and there along old logging roads that were barely maintained anymore. I didn't plan much. That was the whole point. I figured I'd find a nice place to set up camp, hike around, maybe fish in the creek, and just be away from people for a little while. I left on a Thursday afternoon, cruising down 2-lane highways under a clear blue sky. The farther south I got, the emptier the roads became. Little farms with rusty tractors, broken fences, and weathered barns slipped past my window. Gas stations became fewer, and by the time I turned off the main road onto a cracked, narrow blacktop leading into the forest, it felt like I had driven straight into another time. There was no gate, no welcome sign, nothing official. Just a faded old wooden board with a bullet hole through it that said Jackson Hill Forest, public use, nailed crookedly to a tree. Beyond that, the road turned into packed dirt, rutted with potholes and scattered with fallen leaves. I drove slowly, the Tahoe groaning over the rough ground. The woods were thick, dense, the kind of place where daylight didn't seem to matter much. Everything was under a heavy green shadow, even though the sun was still high. Trees pressed in close to the road, gnarled and heavy with moss. About 3 miles in, I found a clearing big enough to pull into. It wasn't much, just a flat spot with an old fire ring made of stones in the center. Somebody had left behind a few charred logs and a half-melted beer can. It would do. I got out, stretched my legs, and listened. Nothing but the sound of leaves rustling and a few crows calling far off. No cars, no voices, not even the distant hum of a plane. I could have been the only person left in the world. Felt good. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing where the ground was soft but dry. It took longer than it should have because a couple of the poles were bent, but I wasn't in any hurry. Once the tent was up, I rolled out my sleeping bag inside, set up my little stove on a flat rock, and got a fire going in the ring with some sticks and the dry branches that littered the ground. I made a sandwich, ate it sitting on a log, and watched the fire crackle as the sun started sinking behind the trees. The woods turned darker and darker, shadows melting together until everything was just shapes in the low light. When night fully fell, it got cold fast. I pulled on a sweatshirt, sat closer to the fire, and cracked open a beer. The stars came out, clearer than I'd seen them in years. The Milky Way stretched overhead like spilled sugar. I stayed up until the fire burned down to glowing coals. Then I doused it carefully with water, made sure there were no embers left, and crawled into my tent. The ground was lumpy and hard despite the pad I had under my sleeping bag, but I was tired enough not to care. I fell asleep fast. The first night passed without anything strange. I woke up once around 3 a.m. needing to pee. I unzipped the tent, stepped outside into the freezing dark, and did my business a few feet away. The woods were absolutely still. No wind, no bugs, no sounds at all. It was eerie, but not enough to spook me. I got back in the tent, zipped it tight, and slept till morning. The next day, I decided to explore a little. I packed a small day pack with some water, beef jerky, and a first aid kit, and set off down an old logging road that led deeper into the forest. The road wasn't really a road anymore, just a faint double line of flattened grass and old ruts barely visible under fallen leaves. It was peaceful at first. The forest smelled like earth and wet leaves, and sunlight filtered down in narrow golden beams that shifted as the wind stirred the branches above. I walked for about an hour, following the road as it twisted through the trees. Sometimes it climbed over low ridges, sometimes it dipped into shallow gullies where water had carved narrow channels into the mud. I didn't see any other people. No tents, no cars, no signs that anyone else had been out there recently. Just a few old beer cans and a rusted-out mattress spring leaning against a tree that looked like it had been there for years. After a while, the road forked. One path veered left and downhill. The other curved right and climbed a little. I picked the right-hand path without thinking much about it. About 10 minutes later, I found something strange. It was a little structure tucked back among the trees, an old shack falling apart with a slanted roof and rotting wood walls. No windows. The door hung crookedly off one hinge. It looked like it might have been a hunting cabin decades ago, but now it was just a skeleton of itself, leaning like it was about to fall over. Curious, I approached it slowly. I half expected the thing to collapse at any second. The door was stuck halfway open. I leaned in and peered inside. The air smelled of mildew and rot. The floor was dirt, covered in old leaves and bits of broken wood. In one corner, there was a crumpled pile of cloth, maybe an old sleeping bag or tarp, and some empty cans stacked neatly in a pyramid. Whoever had been there had been gone a long time, or so I thought. I was about to turn back when I noticed something odd. Near the pile of cans, half buried in the dirt, there were tracks. Not animal tracks, boot prints, fresh ones, deep enough to still hold their shape clearly. And they were bigger than mine by at least 2 sizes. It gave me a bad feeling I couldn't shake off. I backed away from the shack and decided to head back toward camp. Maybe I wasn't as alone out there as I thought, and the idea of running into someone who lived in a place like that wasn't comforting. I walked faster on the way back, ears straining for any sound. Every twig snapping made my heart jump a little. But I didn't see anyone. When I got back to my clearing, I felt a little better. The fire ring, the tent, the truck sitting there. It all looked normal, untouched. I spent the afternoon fishing in the creek a few hundred yards away. Caught 2 small bass, let them go. Tried to relax. By the time it got dark again, I had almost convinced myself I was overreacting. I made a bigger fire that night, using thicker logs so it would burn longer, and cooked a hot meal on my stove, beans and rice from a can. I sat by the fire, eating slowly, listening to the crackle and the occasional hoot of an owl far off. The woods didn't feel so friendly anymore. I stayed up later, not wanting to crawl into the tent. There was something about being zipped up in that thin nylon shell, blind to everything outside, that suddenly didn't sit right with me. But eventually I had to sleep. The fire had burned low again, and I was dead tired from hiking. I made sure everything was packed up. Food in the truck, no scraps left around, and got into the tent, zipping it all the way closed. I lay there a long time, listening. At some point, I drifted off. I don't know what woke me. Maybe a sound. Maybe just instinct. I opened my eyes into the pitch black and lay still, heart pounding hard in my chest. I strained to hear. For a minute, nothing. Just the quiet roar of blood in my ears. Then faint but real, a soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. Another, closer. I stopped breathing, trying to make no sound at all. The footsteps circled the tent slowly, deliberate, careful. Not an animal. Too heavy, too slow. Something brushed against the side of the tent, making the fabric ripple inward slightly. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stop from making any noise. The footsteps moved away, then stopped. Dead silence. I didn't move for what felt like an hour, muscles cramping from the tension. Eventually, as the first pale light of dawn started to seep through the trees, I dared to unzip the tent just a little and peek out. Nothing. The clearing was empty. No sign of anyone. I packed up as fast as I could, shoving everything into the truck without caring about neatness. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I was folding up the tent, I noticed something that made my stomach flip. On the far side of the clearing, about 20 feet from where I had been sleeping, there was a single footprint pressed into the soft dirt. Boot tread. Bigger than mine. Bigger than any normal person's. I finished packing, jumped into the truck, and started the engine. The Tahoe rumbled to life, and I slammed it into reverse, backing out of the clearing and onto the dirt road. I didn't look back. The drive out felt longer than it. It was early October of 2021 when I decided to take a camping trip alone for the first time in my life. I was 32 years old, living in Southern Oregon at the time, and had been craving some real time away from work and people. Life had been heavy. A bad breakup, too many late nights at the office, and that feeling like I was stuck on a hamster wheel every day. I needed something different, something that would knock the dust off my soul. So I packed up my truck with all my gear: a thick canvas tent, sleeping bag, camping stove, water jugs, a small cooler, a basic first aid kit, and my old hiking boots that were more duct tape than leather at this point. I chose a place called Broken Ridge, about 2 hours northeast of where I lived. It was known for being remote, but not so remote that you couldn't find a dirt road or a faint trail if you wandered far enough. The name sounded good to me, broken like how I felt, and a ridge like something you had to climb over. I figured if I could survive a few days out there alone, I could survive anything life threw at me. The drive out was uneventful. The trees got thicker and the road narrower the farther I went. Eventually, I turned onto a gravel road that rattled my teeth and shook every loose thing in my truck. About 8 miles down, there was a tiny pull-off just big enough for one vehicle. No official campsite markers, no other cars in sight. Perfect. I got out and stretched, feeling that deep tightness in my back that comes from too many hours behind a desk. The air smelled crisp and clean, like wet pine needles and distant rain. It was cloudy but dry for now. I could hear birds calling out across the trees, and somewhere farther away, the soft rush of water. Maybe a creek or a river. I hauled my gear out of the truck and started setting up camp about 20 yards into the woods, where the trees opened into a small, flat clearing covered in moss and fallen leaves. The first day passed easily. I set up the tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, collected some wood for a fire, and cooked myself a simple dinner. A can of chili heated directly on the stove with some crackers on the side. I wasn't trying to win any awards. Just being out there was enough. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. I sat by the fire, drinking instant coffee, staring at the flames until my eyelids got heavy. Then I put out the fire, zipped myself into the tent, and slept deeper than I had in months. The second day, I decided to do some hiking. I left most of my gear behind, packing only what I needed: water, a few granola bars, a map, a small compass, and a whistle just in case. I wore my thick jacket, a beanie, and gloves, even though hiking would warm me up fast. The plan was simple: head north for a few hours, following the natural curves of the land, and then loop back before the sun got too low. At first, the walk was peaceful. The ground was soft underfoot, muffled by layers of pine needles and leaves. The trees were mostly tall pines, with the occasional deadfall blocking the way. Every so often, I had to climb over or around a massive fallen trunk, the bark soft and crumbling under my hands. Birds flitted from branch to branch overhead. A few times I spotted tiny brown squirrels darting across the forest floor, chattering nervously as they gathered their winter stores. I didn't see a single person the whole morning, and that suited me just fine. Around noon, the clouds thickened. It got darker under the trees, and the air felt colder, heavier. I decided to start looping back. I pulled out my compass, checked my bearings, and turned southwest. That was when things started feeling off. first, it was little stuff. The forest seemed quieter than before. The cheerful chirping of birds had died down, replaced by a kind of heavy, unnatural silence. Even my own footsteps sounded muted, like the forest was swallowing the noise. Then, every once in a while, I thought I heard something. A branch snapping, the rustle of leaves. But every time I stopped and listened, it was dead silent again. I told myself it was probably just animals moving through the brush. Deer, maybe, or the wind. But there was no wind. I picked up my pace. The landscape got harder to read. Trees grew closer together, and the ground started sloping downward in strange ways. More than once, I had to detour around thick clumps of undergrowth or steep gullies. I glanced at my compass regularly, but something wasn't adding up. According to the compass, I was going the right way, but the terrain didn't look familiar. I hadn't climbed this many ridges on the way out. I hadn't crossed any streams. I hadn't seen this many boulders either. An uneasy feeling crept up my spine. I told myself to stay calm. Panicking would only make things worse. I kept walking, eyes scanning for anything I recognized. The sky kept getting darker, and the air smelled like rain was coming. After another hour of hard walking, I had to admit it, I was lost. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't marked my trail. I hadn't set any waypoints. I was alone, miles from the nearest road, with no real idea which direction camp was anymore. My stomach turned sour with fear. I forced myself to sit down on a rock and think. First things first, conserve energy. Getting tired or injured would only make things worse. Second, prioritize shelter. If it started raining hard, I'd need to stay dry. Third, find a way back carefully. I decided to backtrack the way I had come. As best I could remember, there had been a large boulder shaped like a leaning tree stump about a half-mile back. If I could find that, I could at least orient myself. I got up and started moving again. The woods felt different now. The trees seemed to press in closer. Shadows pooled under the branches. My ears kept playing tricks on me. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing. A few times I thought I saw something move between the trees. A dark shape low to the ground, but it always vanished when I blinked. The boulder never showed up. Neither did anything else I recognized. After a while, the terrain dropped sharply downhill. I stumbled down a steep slope, grabbing onto tree trunks to keep from falling. At the bottom, I found a creek, shallow but fast-moving. The water was clear, and I knelt to fill one of my bottles. As I drank, I noticed something strange. A boot print in the mud, half washed away by the water. It wasn't mine. It was bigger than my boot, wider too, and pointed in a direction opposite the flow of the water. For a moment, I just stared at it. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs. Whoever it belonged to, if they were still around, could be my only hope. Or they could be a problem. I stood up, wiped my hands on my pants, and decided to follow the creek upstream. Water often leads to people, cabins, campsites, roads. The walking was slow and difficult. Slippery rocks, dense brush, fallen logs. A few times I slipped and nearly fell into the freezing water. But I pushed on. An hour passed, then another. My legs started to ache. My shoulders were stiff from constantly balancing and catching myself. Finally, I saw something ahead, a dark shape through the trees, a cabin. My heart leapt in my chest. It looked old and run down, half swallowed by the forest. The roof sagged in the middle. One of the windows was cracked, but it was shelter and maybe, just maybe, someone was there. I approached slowly, every instinct on high alert. The door was half hanging off its hinges. I peered inside. Empty, dusty, some broken furniture, an old wood stove in one corner. No signs of recent use. Still, it was better than nothing. I decided to stay for the night. I set up a small fire in the stove using sticks and bark, careful not to let too much smoke escape. I ate a granola bar, drank some water, and rolled myself up in my jacket on the floor. I was too exhausted to think straight. The fear and adrenaline had worn off, leaving only bone-deep tiredness. Sleep came in fitful, shallow bursts. Every little creak of the cabin, every drip of water from the eaves made me jerk awake. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching outside, but when I held my breath and listened, the sound faded into nothing. Morning came gray and cold. I woke stiff and sore but alive. That counted for something. I ate another granola bar, packed up my things, and decided to keep following the creek upstream. If I kept moving, I had to come across something eventually. A trail, a road, anything. The second day was harder than the first. My feet were blistered. My legs cramped every time I stopped. It started drizzling around noon, turning the forest into a slick, muddy mess. Several times I lost the creek, only to find it again after struggling through thick brush. But finally, in the late afternoon, I heard something new. A low rumble, deep and steady. A road. I stumbled toward the sound, crashing through the undergrowth without caring how much noise I made. After a few painful minutes, I burst out of the trees onto a narrow 2-lane road. I was 29 when I decided to take my first solo camping trip. It was early September of 2022, and I had just finished a rough patch at work. I was working at a tire factory in Boise, Idaho, long shifts, 6 days a week. I was exhausted, my head was always pounding, and I just needed some air that didn't smell like rubber and sweat. I wasn't really the adventurous type, not really the guy to take off into the woods alone. But that summer, I felt like if I didn't get away, even for just a couple of days, I was going to lose it. I borrowed an old canvas tent from my cousin, packed up my Ford Escape with supplies, and drove out toward Red Pine Lake. It was a quiet spot about 2 hours north of Boise, tucked away in the foothills. Hardly anyone went out there after Labor Day. The tourists were gone, the locals had gone back to work and school, and the weather was just starting to cool off at night. I left town around noon. It was one of those perfectly clear days, blue skies, warm sun, dry air. The drive was smooth at first, but the last stretch was all gravel and dirt, and I had to slow way down to keep from sliding into the ditch. There were deep potholes everywhere, and every few minutes my little SUV would bang hard enough that I thought something would fall off. When I finally pulled into the makeshift parking area near the trailhead, there were no other cars around. Just a hand-painted sign nailed to a tree that said, "Red Pine Lake Trail 2 miles." I killed the engine and sat there for a minute, just listening. No cars, no voices, no sounds but the breeze and some birds. I packed light, just a backpack with a sleeping bag, a camp stove, a few cans of chili, some water bottles, a flashlight, and a cheap fixed blade knife I had bought at a gas station on the way up. I figured 2 nights max. No reason to overpack. I slung my backpack over one shoulder, locked the car, and started hiking. The trail wasn't bad. A little overgrown in spots, but easy enough to follow. The late summer sun was filtering through the pine trees, making long stripes of light on the ground. I took my time, stopping every so often to drink water and wipe sweat off my forehead. About halfway up, I crossed a small wooden bridge over a dry creek bed. I remember thinking that if it rained, that creek could turn into a real river fast. The thought made me glance at the sky, but it was still clear. After maybe an hour, I reached Red Pine Lake. It was small, barely more than a pond really, with muddy banks and a thin ring of cattails. The water was glassy and still, reflecting the trees perfectly. On the far side of the lake, a narrow finger of land stuck out like a little peninsula. It looked like the best spot to set up camp, away from the trail and with a good view of the water. I circled around, stepping carefully through the mud, until I reached the peninsula. I stomped down a patch of grass with my boots and set up the old tent. It took longer than I expected because the poles were bent and the canvas was stiff, but after about 20 minutes, I had it standing. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering firewood. There wasn't much deadfall nearby, so I had to venture back up the trail a ways, dragging down dry branches and snapping them into manageable pieces. I made a small fire pit with some rocks I found and got a little fire going, more for comfort than anything else. It wasn't cold yet. When the sun started to go down, the air cooled fast. I heated up a can of chili on the camp stove, ate it straight out of the can, and watched the sky turn from blue to orange to deep purple. I had a little battery-powered lantern, but I turned it off early. The fire was enough light, and honestly, I liked the feeling of being disconnected, of not having screens glowing in my face. Around 10 o'clock, I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped up the tent, and tried to sleep. I thought I would crash right away after the hike and all the fresh air, but I couldn't settle. Every little sound outside made my ears perk up. A branch snapping, something splashing in the water, wind rattling the tent flaps. I kept telling myself it was just animals, deer, raccoons, birds, nothing to worry about. At some point, I must have drifted off, but then I woke up suddenly. It was pitch black inside the tent, and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. I laid there for a second, my heart thudding hard in my chest, trying to figure out what had woken me. I didn't hear anything at first. Then I did. It was a soft rustling, like someone or something moving through the grass just outside the tent. Not heavy footsteps, but not small either. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The sound moved closer, circling the tent slowly. I could hear the grass swishing and the faint crunch of dead leaves. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight in my hand under the sleeping bag. I stayed as still as I could, barely even breathing. Whatever it was, it circled the tent twice, then moved away toward the lake. I didn't hear it splash into the water. It just faded into the distance. After a long time, I forced myself to relax a little. Probably just a deer or a big raccoon. I kept telling myself that. I didn't really believe it, but it was the only way I was going to get any sleep. The rest of the night passed slow and miserable. Every time I dozed off, I woke up again at the slightest noise. By the time the sky started to lighten, I was exhausted. I climbed out of the tent, stretched my stiff legs, and poked at the ashes of the fire. Cold. I decided to explore a little after breakfast. Maybe get my mind off the night. I ate a granola bar, packed some water in my jacket pocket, and started walking around the lake. It was peaceful in the daylight. Birds singing, frogs croaking, sun warming my back. I found some animal tracks in the mud, deer, I think, and followed them into the trees for a while just for something to do. About a half-mile into the woods, I found something weird. It was an old campsite, real old. There was a rusted-out metal frame of a folding chair, a crushed tin coffee pot, and some scraps of faded canvas tangled in the bushes. The fire pit was still there too, just a circle of blackened stones, half buried in dead leaves. I felt a little shiver run up my spine. It wasn't like a scary movie kind of thing, just the feeling that someone had been here once, a long time ago, and left in a hurry. I didn't hang around. I turned back toward my own camp. The second night, I made the fire bigger. I figured if there were animals around, a good blaze would keep them away. I ate another can of chili, cleaned up, and sat by the fire until my eyes burned from the smoke. When I finally crawled into the tent, I left the lantern on low, just for a little comfort. It didn't help. Around midnight, the sounds started again. This time, heavier, more deliberate. It wasn't circling the tent either. It was coming straight toward it. I gripped my knife tight, heart hammering. The footsteps stopped right outside. I could hear breathing. Low, rough breathing, like someone who had just run a long way. I thought about yelling, about jumping out with the knife, but I couldn't make myself move. I was paralyzed with fear. Then something bumped the tent wall. Not hard, but enough to make the canvas ripple. My mind raced. Bear? Mountain lion? But the breathing didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human. After what felt like forever, the breathing stopped. The footsteps retreated, slow and heavy, back toward the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the knife, sweating, shaking. The first light, I packed up. I didn't even eat breakfast. I stuffed the sleeping bag into the backpack, collapsed the tent without bothering to fold it properly, and doused the fire with my last water bottle. I didn't care about neatness. I just needed to get out. The hike back to the car felt 10 times longer than it had on the way in. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, sure that I would see someone or something following me, but there was nothing. just empty woods. When I reached the trailhead, my car was still there. No broken windows, no slashed tires. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there for a minute, just breathing. Then I started the engine and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. When I finally pulled into a gas station to fill up, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I looked awful, pale, hollow-eyed, sweaty. I went into the bathroom, washed my face, and stared at myself for a long time. I never found out what was out there that night. Maybe it was just a crazy drifter, maybe a hunter who got lost and stumbled onto my camp. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, feeding my fear until it felt real. I'll never know. But I know this. I never camped alone again after that. Not once. 2 weeks later, I went back to Red Pine Lake with a buddy. We brought rifles just in case. But when we got there, the old campsite was gone. No tent scraps, no coffee pot, no fire pit. Like it had never been there. We didn't stay long. I learned something important on that trip. Nature isn't scary. People are. The woods don't care if you're scared. But someone hiding out there. I had never been one for the great outdoors. Growing up, I preferred the comfort of home, with all its predictable routines and soft, warm beds. But after a rough year of stress at work and a breakup that left me feeling hollow, I figured a weekend camping trip in the wilderness might do me some good. I had always heard that being in nature could be a way to reconnect with yourself, to find peace and quiet, to clear your head. So, I made a decision that might have seemed reckless to some. I'd spend the weekend alone in the forest, camping in a remote area. The year was 2023, and I was 32 years old. My name's Jake, and I had been living in a small apartment on the edge of town for the last few years. I worked as an architect, spending most of my days glued to a desk, sketching designs for buildings I would never actually visit. When I finally packed my bags and headed for the forest, I felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. The drive out to the campsite took nearly 2 hours, and the further I went, the less civilization I saw. I passed through small towns, rural roads, and dirt tracks until I reached the edge of the national park. The campsite I had chosen was called Pine Hollow, a quiet spot nestled between tall pine trees, with a creek running nearby. I found the place online, and the reviews had been mostly positive. People talked about its seclusion and the peacefulness of the area. That sounded perfect to me. There was a small ranger station at the entrance, but the park was vast and Pine Hollow was far off the main trail, tucked away from most tourists. I didn't mind that. It was exactly what I wanted. When I arrived, the ranger gave me a brief rundown of the rules. No fires after sunset, no loud music, and most importantly, make sure to pack out everything you bring in. I nodded along, took my map, and drove to the designated campsite. It was just me and a few other campers scattered along the edge of the area. I felt strangely alone, but not in a bad way. For the first time in a while, I felt like I could breathe. I set up my tent, laid out my gear, and took a long look around. The trees loomed tall above me, their branches swaying slightly in the wind. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and cool. It was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. I set up my camp in the late afternoon, and once the tent was secure and my gear in place, I decided to explore a bit. The creek was only a short walk away from my site. It was a small, clear stream, and as I knelt down to dip my hands in, I could feel the cold water flow through my fingers. It was refreshing even in the cool weather. As the sun started to dip lower, I decided to head back to my campsite to make dinner. I had packed a simple meal, freeze-dried pasta, and some snacks, but the solitude was enough to make even that feel satisfying. The night fell quickly. The sky turned a deep blue, then black, with stars emerging in the absence of light pollution. There was no sound except for the gentle rustling of the wind through the trees. I sat by my small campfire, the flickering light casting long shadows around me. I felt strangely comfortable, like I could almost forget the chaos of life for a moment. I even thought to myself that this was exactly what I needed. But as the night deepened, things started to change. The air grew colder, and the woods around me seemed to come alive in a way that made me uneasy. It wasn't that I could hear anything specific, but it was the silence between the sounds that unsettled me. There were no crickets, no birds, no animals moving around. The stillness was heavy, almost suffocating. The wind picked up, rustling the branches above me in a low, ominous way. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the forest settling into the night. I had no cell phone signal, which didn't surprise me, given how far out I was. It wasn't a big deal. I had come here to disconnect, to escape the constant barrage of emails and messages that filled my life. But when I tried to sleep that night, I found it difficult. I kept hearing things, soft footsteps, the sound of branches snapping, the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Every time I opened my eyes, the shadows in the tent seemed to shift, though I couldn't explain why. It was as if something was watching me. Eventually, I must have drifted off to sleep, though it wasn't a peaceful rest. I awoke several times during the night, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent, listening intently for any noise. The campfire had long since burned out, leaving only the faintest glow from the dying embers. I could hear the occasional rustling of leaves in the distance, but nothing that seemed like an animal. There was no comforting sound of birds or insects, just silence. The next morning, I woke up with a start. It was still early, just after dawn, and the air was crisp. I felt groggy, but the odd feeling from the previous night lingered in my mind. I made coffee, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. As I sipped the hot drink, I looked around, and everything seemed normal. The trees stood tall and still, the creek bubbled quietly in the distance, and the sun was creeping over the horizon. But something was off. I packed up my camp and decided to take a short hike. I didn't want to let the strange feeling ruin my trip, but I also couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. The path I took was winding and quiet, leading me deeper into the forest. It felt like I was walking through an endless tunnel of trees, their branches stretching out like arms trying to grab me. I pushed through it, ignoring the uncomfortable feeling that crept up my spine. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The only sounds were the crunching of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call from high above. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A campfire. But it wasn't like any fire I'd seen before. It wasn't the warm, inviting glow of a regular campfire. This one was small, flickering weakly, almost as if it had just been extinguished. And there was something about it that felt wrong. The surrounding area was empty, but the fire was still warm, the smoke curling lazily into the air. I approached cautiously, my steps quiet on the forest floor. As I neared the fire, I noticed something strange. There were tracks in the dirt, footprints, human footprints. They were fresh, no more than a few hours old. But they weren't the kind of tracks you'd expect from a regular hiker. They were too erratic, too uneven, as if someone had been walking in a hurry or stumbling. I knelt down to get a closer look at the prints, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it, a crack in the branches behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. I slowly turned around, expecting to see another hiker, but the area was still empty. The silence had returned, even heavier than before. I stood up and began backing away, my mind racing with possibilities. I didn't know if it was just my nerves getting the best of me, but I felt like I wasn't alone. I decided it was time to leave. I retraced my steps, walking quickly back to the campsite, trying not to look over my shoulder. The forest had suddenly become oppressive, its towering trees seeming to close in on me. When I reached the campsite, I grabbed my gear, packed it up hastily, and began the long drive back to civilization. But even as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me the entire time. Something that was still out there, hidden in the shadows of the trees. And for the first time in my life, I understood the true meaning of isolation. I would never return to Pine Hollow again. It was the summer of 2019 when I made the decision to go on a solo camping trip, something I had been wanting to do for a long time. My name's Ethan, and I was 28 at the time. I had spent years hiking through various national parks, camping with friends, and taking weekend trips into the wilderness. But this time, I wanted to do it alone. I thought it would be a good way to push my limits, challenge myself, and find some peace away from the noise of the city. I chose the Black Mountain Wilderness area for my adventure. It's located in a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina, known for its rugged terrain, dense forests, and lack of foot traffic. I had heard that it was one of the most beautiful but unforgiving places in the region, which made it perfect for a solo trip. The plan was simple: hike for 3 days, camp out in the wild, and disconnect from everything. No phone signal, no distractions, just me and nature. I packed my gear carefully: a lightweight tent, sleeping bag, a portable stove, a first aid kit, and a few days' worth of food. I also brought a compass, a map of the area, a small knife, and a flashlight. The essentials. I was confident. I'd done solo trips before, though not in such remote places. But I had read up on the area, checked weather forecasts, and felt prepared. The hike up to my first campsite was relatively easy. The trail was well marked, and the weather was clear, with just a slight breeze. I walked for hours, surrounded by towering trees, the only sounds being the crunch of dirt and leaves beneath my boots. The mountain air was cool, and the scent of pine filled my nostrils. It was peaceful in a way that cities could never be. No rush, no people, just the quiet hum of nature. By the time I set up camp, the sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting a warm orange light over the landscape. I found a small clearing near a stream, where I could hear the gentle flow of water. It was the perfect spot to rest for the night. The first night was uneventful. I ate a simple meal of dried pasta and beef jerky, enjoying the solitude. I set up my tent, crawled inside, and fell asleep to the soft sound of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was a deep sleep, one where I felt completely safe and relaxed, far from any worries or stress. But the second day, that's when things started to change. The morning arrived with a thick fog blanketing the valley. It was like a veil hiding everything around me. I had heard that fog was common in the Appalachian Mountains, but it was still disorienting. The world felt quieter, and the trees, usually towering and majestic, seemed like shadows looming in the mist. I packed up my tent, ate some breakfast, and decided to continue my hike. The trail had become more challenging, steeper, and less defined. As I ventured deeper into the wilderness, the fog grew thicker. My visibility was limited to just a few feet in front of me, and I had to focus intently to avoid tripping over roots or rocks. It was around noon when I reached a point on the trail where I had to make a decision. The path forked, with one trail leading up toward a ridge and another heading toward a valley below. I had studied the map before I left, but the fog made it hard to make out any landmarks. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to take the trail toward the valley, hoping to find a better campsite by the stream I had crossed earlier. The fog was still thick, and the silence around me felt unnerving. It was like the entire world was holding its breath. I don't know why, but I felt watched. Not in a paranormal sense, but in the way you sometimes feel when you're alone and something doesn't seem quite right. I shook it off. I was alone in the wilderness, of course I would feel like that. But then came the first strange noise. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I could identify. It was a low, scraping sound, like something large moving through the underbrush just out of sight. I froze, my heart pounding. I was alone, right? I scanned the trees around me, my hand instinctively moving toward the knife I kept clipped to my belt. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the wind in the trees. I pushed forward, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. The more I hiked, the stronger the sensation became. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me flinch. At one point, I had to cross a small ravine. I found a fallen tree that I could use as a bridge, but as I stepped onto it, I noticed something strange. There were fresh tracks in the mud, large, human-like tracks. They weren't animal prints, and they weren't mine. I stood frozen for a long time, staring at the tracks. They were recent, probably no more than a few hours old. I glanced around, but the fog obscured everything beyond a few feet. It was disorienting, to say the least. Who would be out here? The area was so remote that the chances of encountering other hikers were slim. Still, I couldn't ignore the fact that someone big, had passed through here recently. I took a deep breath and forced myself to continue, but my pace quickened. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be lurking in the fog. Person? Another hiker who had gotten lost? A hunter? My instincts screamed at me to be cautious, but I couldn't shake the need to press on. I had come here to challenge myself, after all. By late afternoon, I found a spot by a small creek to set up camp. The fog hadn't lifted, and the trees around me seemed to close in tighter. I set up my tent as quickly as I could, almost in a frenzy. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but I couldn't let my guard down. The night was eerily quiet. No animals, no wind, nothing. Just the constant trickle of water from the creek. I cooked my dinner quickly, ate it, and retreated into my tent. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. Then, in the dead of night, I heard something. A faint sound, barely audible above the creek, but distinct enough to make my heart skip a beat. It was a soft footstep, followed by another, then more. Someone was outside my tent. I lay there, completely still, not even daring to breathe. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving in a circle around my campsite. My mind raced. I knew there were no other campers in the area. It was too far off the beaten path for anyone to just stumble across it. The footsteps came closer, now directly outside the tent. My pulse was racing, and every muscle in my body was tense. I gripped my knife tightly, my hands slick with sweat. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. I had no choice. I had to do something. The only problem was, I didn't know what. My mind raced through 100 possibilities. Should I confront them, call out, or remain silent, hoping they would go away? I decided to stay quiet and wait. I didn't want to risk drawing attention to myself, but I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence. Then came the sound of something or someone sitting down on the ground near my tent. I held my breath, waiting for what would come next. Minutes passed, felt like hours, but there was no further movement. Whoever it was had either left or fallen asleep. I waited until I was certain it was safe. My mind was still racing, but the silence had returned, so I slowly unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The fog was still thick, but the area around me appeared empty. I waited another few minutes before stepping outside, my knife still in hand. The ground was undisturbed, and there was no sign of anyone having been there. I looked up and down the creek, but the fog made it impossible to see much beyond a few feet. After what felt like an eternity of staring into the fog, I made the decision to leave. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, not bothering to cook or prepare a proper meal. I just needed to get out of there. As I hiked out, the fog began to clear, and by the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was beginning to rise. I was exhausted, shaken, but I had made it. Whatever had happened that night remained a mystery, but I had learned one thing. Sometimes, being prepared for the worst isn't enough. The wild doesn't care about your plans or your fears. It's a place where the unknown can be just as dangerous as anything you can see. I went home that day, but I never forgot the feeling of being watched. I never went back to the Black Mountain Wilderness area, and I'm not sure if I ever will. It was early autumn when I decided to take a solo camping trip. I needed to escape the constant noise of the city and get some fresh air, even if it meant venturing into the wild alone. The place I chose was a small, remote spot in the mountains, about 10 miles from the nearest road. I had been there once before with a group of friends, but this time, I wanted to experience it alone. No distractions, just me, the forest, and the night sky. I packed my gear the day before: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and all the other essentials. My backpack was heavier than I liked, but I told myself I'd get used to it. I set off early the next morning, feeling excited and determined to disconnect from everything. The weather was perfect, cool but not too cold, with the sun filtering through the leaves. I started hiking up the trail, my boots crunching on the dirt path, the birds chirping around me. The trail was well maintained at first, and I made good time. The trees were thick, and the scent of pine filled the air. The higher I climbed, the quieter it became. Soon, I couldn't hear anything except the sound of my footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves. The forest seemed peaceful, but also a bit eerie, as if it were keeping secrets from me. The farther I walked, the more isolated I felt. It was around noon when I reached the campsite. It was a clearing near a small stream, just big enough for a tent and a campfire. The site looked just like I remembered. Nothing had changed. The creek gurgled softly, and the sun filtered down through the branches above, casting dappled shadows on the ground. It felt calming, yet something about it made my skin prickle. It was probably just the solitude, I thought. After all, I'd been on hikes alone before. I set up my tent and arranged my campsite, taking my time to make sure everything was perfect. As I sat down by the stream, I felt a strange mix of peace and unease. I could hear the sound of my breathing as I let out a deep sigh, trying to relax. I had nothing to worry about, but deep down, there was a nagging feeling, like I was being watched. After a quick lunch, I decided to take a short hike around the area. I followed a narrow trail that branched off from the main one. The trail was less traveled, with overgrown ferns brushing against my legs. It was a perfect spot for an afternoon walk, peaceful and serene. But the deeper I ventured, the more I felt like something wasn't right. The forest grew denser, and the trail seemed to narrow with every step I took. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just a heavy silence. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it only intensified as I moved deeper into the woods. I noticed a few strange marks on the trees, scratches, almost like claw marks. They weren't deep, but they were recent. I stopped in my tracks, my heart beating a little faster. I didn't know what to make of it. Bears were common in the area, but they usually avoided people. Maybe it was just the wind or some other animal, I thought. I pressed on, but something in the pit of my stomach told me to turn back. As I walked, I heard a faint sound, like a branch snapping. I froze, my heart pounding. The noise was coming from behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. No movement, no rustling, just the thick forest stretching on for miles. Shaking it off, I decided to head back to camp. I had wandered far enough for one day, but as I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I quickened my pace, my boots thudding softly against the ground, and the sound of my breath became louder in my ears. I finally reached the clearing again, but my sense of unease didn't fade. I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me. The rest of the evening went by uneventfully. I gathered some firewood, made a small fire, and cooked my dinner. I tried to relax, but the nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. The forest was too still, too quiet. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, but it didn't make me feel any better. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just out of view, but every time I looked, there was nothing. Night fell, and I crawled into my tent, hoping that sleep would finally give me a break from the tension. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind rustling the trees above. My eyes darted around the inside of the tent, every little noise making my heart race. I could hear the sounds of the forest around me, but it was different now. The wind wasn't calming. It felt menacing, like something was just waiting for the right moment to strike. I woke up in the middle of the night, my body tensed, heart pounding. There was a noise outside my tent. It was subtle at first, just a faint scraping sound, like something dragging across the ground. I lay still, not daring to move, my breath shallow. It sounded like it was right next to me, just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. My mind raced. What could it be? A bear? A mountain lion? Or was it something else? I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but then the scraping sound grew louder. It was almost rhythmic, like whatever it was had a purpose. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I had to do something. I reached for my flashlight, which was resting on the ground beside me. My fingers brushed the cool metal, and I grabbed it tightly. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, trying not to make a sound. The light from the flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the ground. I scanned the area around me, but there was nothing. The fire had long since burned out, and the darkness felt almost suffocating. I stood frozen, listening intently. Then I heard it again, a loud thump, like something heavy was moving around. My heart raced as I stepped out of the tent, the cold night air hitting me in the face. I scanned the area, shining the flashlight across the clearing. Everything was still. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the creek gurgled softly in the distance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just waiting. I took a few cautious steps toward the edge of the clearing, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. That's when I saw it, a set of footprints leading into the woods. They were fresh, the earth still soft around the edges. The prints were too big to be human and too deep to be an animal. They looked like something heavy had walked through the area, something big. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I needed to leave, but part of me hesitated. What if I was overreacting? What if it was just an animal or maybe another camper who had wandered off the trail? I turned to head back to the tent, but then I heard a branch snap behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. That's when I decided. I packed up quickly, throwing everything into my backpack without much care. My hands were shaking as I secured the tent, not bothering to fold it properly. The noise behind me grew louder. Whatever it was getting closer. I could hear heavy breathing, like something large was moving through the underbrush. My stomach churned as I grabbed the rest of my things and bolted for the trail. I didn't look back. I ran through the dark, the beam from my flashlight bouncing wildly. My feet slipped on the uneven ground, and I almost fell twice, but I kept going. The sound of footsteps behind me seemed to follow, getting louder with every step I took. I don't know how long I ran, but I didn't stop until I reached the road. By then, my legs were sore, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I collapsed on the side of the road, exhausted, scared, and confused. There was no sign of whatever had been following me. No footprints, no sounds. But I knew what I had heard. I had felt it deep in my gut. Something was out there and it wasn't friendly. I sat there for a while, gathering my bearings. The night was still, but the forest felt distant now. The sounds of the wild didn't seem so threatening anymore. I was safe, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in those woods was still out there, waiting. In the end, I made it back home, but I never went camping in that area again. I couldn't explain what happened, and maybe I never will, but the forest had shown me a side of itself that I would never forget. It was late October when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in the woods near the small town of Pine Hill. The kind of place people don't talk much about unless you're from around there. I had grown up in the area but had moved to the city for work, so when I had some time off, I figured I'd return for a bit of solitude. I'd forgotten how quiet the forest could be. I wasn't exactly sure what I was hoping to get out of it. Maybe some peace, maybe to clear my head from all the noise and distractions I'd grown accustomed to. It was just me, a backpack, a tent, and a few days to disconnect. The hike to my chosen spot wasn't too bad. The fall leaves crunched underfoot as I made my way along a worn trail, the air crisp but not cold enough to feel uncomfortable. Pine Hill's forest was familiar, but it still held an eerie quality. The trees seemed taller than I remembered, their branches thin and bare against the gray sky. The higher I climbed, the quieter it became. I didn't mind the silence, though it did feel strange. There was no sound from the usual birds or animals, no wind rustling the leaves, nothing. It was the kind of stillness that felt almost oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I set up camp near a small creek, a place I used to visit as a child. It had always been a peaceful spot, and I figured it would be a good place to relax. I pitched my tent, gathered a bit of firewood, and started a small fire. The warmth from the flames was comforting as I cooked a simple meal of beans and rice over the fire. It wasn't much, but it was enough for me. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet, trying to absorb the feeling of being back here in this place, so removed from the world. As night began to settle in, the sky darkened, and the sounds of the forest began to change. The faint rustling of the wind started to pick up, the branches swaying slightly in the breeze. It was peaceful at first, but then I began to hear other noises. Distant sounds that didn't quite fit. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. I figured it was probably just a deer or some other small animal, so I didn't think much of it. Still, the noises seemed a little too loud, too close. Every now and then, I'd look over my shoulder, half expecting to see something in the shadows, but each time, nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. By the time I finished eating, the fire had died down to a low glow, and the dark was swallowing the campsite whole. I made sure everything was secure in the tent before lying down, pulling my sleeping bag up around my neck. I wasn't used to the complete darkness. Out in the city, there was always some light, street lamps, headlights, something. But out here, the night was absolute. Just the sound of the wind and the occasional crack of a branch or snap of a twig. I drifted in and out of sleep, waking occasionally to the sound of something moving just outside the reach of the firelight. Could have been an animal, but there was something about the way the noise stopped suddenly, as if whatever it was had been listening, too. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the forest being the forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At some point in the middle of the night, I heard a loud rustling from behind my tent. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the usual sounds of animals I was familiar with. This was something deliberate, almost purposeful. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my mind racing. Should I get my flashlight? Should I go out and check? My instincts told me not to. I lay there in the dark, listening, my heart thumping in my chest. The noise stopped, and the silence that followed was thick, suffocating. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing happened. No more sounds. I told myself to relax and eventually drifted back to sleep, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. It was the kind of sleep that felt like you're constantly aware of your surroundings, just waiting for something to happen. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt both relieved and exhausted. I crawled out of the tent, stretching my stiff limbs, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of unease. The forest was still, but the air was colder now. The sounds of birds and squirrels were back, filling the silence in a way that seemed normal, but the tension in my shoulders didn't ease. Something had happened during the night, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I packed up my gear slowly, trying to convince myself that the noises were just part of the forest. Maybe it had been a bear or a mountain lion, or maybe some other camper had come through, though I hadn't seen any signs of other people around. My gut told me otherwise, but I tried to push it aside. There was no use in getting paranoid. As I began my hike back down the trail, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up once again. I thought I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I stopped, turning around, but there was nothing there, just the empty path winding through the trees. I swallowed hard and started walking again, faster this time. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the path, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see someone there, but there was no one. Just the wind, the trees, the silence. I tried to breathe through it, but my chest felt tight. Then, just as I was coming around a bend in the trail, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There, in the dirt, was a set of fresh footprints. Human footprints, barefoot. They were deep, almost like whoever made them had been walking through the mud, and they were heading in the same direction I was. The prints didn't belong to anyone I knew, and they didn't look like they'd been there long. Panic gripped me. Who could be out here? I was miles from the nearest road, miles from civilization. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Should I keep walking? Should I turn back? My first instinct was to run, but I didn't know where I'd be running to. There was nowhere to hide. I considered the option of climbing a tree, but that would have been futile. Whoever this was had clearly been out here for a while. The prints were too fresh. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and every step I took felt like I was walking straight into something I couldn't escape. I decided to double back, retracing my steps. My breath was ragged, and my heart pounded in my chest. I didn't want to panic, but it was hard not to. I'd seen the signs of a person, and the hair on my neck stood up. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. I kept moving faster, hoping to make it back to my truck before I saw anything else. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of walking, I made it to the trailhead. I didn't even look back. I just kept walking until I reached the parking lot, where my truck was waiting. I threw my gear in the back and drove out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I hit the nearest town. Looking back on it now, I still don't know who or what was out there. The footprints still bother me. I never saw another person on the trail, but I felt like I wasn't alone. Something was there watching me. But whatever it was, it didn't make a move until I was already on my way out. Since that trip, I haven't gone camping alone again. I still enjoy the outdoors, but I haven't been back to that spot. Something about the woods in Pine Hill feels different now. It feels like a place where you can lose yourself if you're not careful. And every time I think back to that night, I hear the crack of a twig in the distance and wonder if I was ever truly alone. I had always considered myself a seasoned camper, at least by the standards of most people. I'd been on numerous trips alone, something I found more peaceful than having someone else there. It was in the fall of 2019, and I had just turned 29. After months of work, I figured I needed a break from the usual noise of life. So, I decided to take a weekend trip to a place I hadn't been before, a secluded spot in the Blue Ridge Mountains, just on the edge of North Carolina. It wasn't a popular camping site, which was exactly what I was after. I had researched it online, reading a few old blog posts about the area. The posts mentioned the serenity of the woods, how few people went out that way, and how it was the perfect place to unwind. So, I packed my gear: a lightweight tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, and enough food to last me the weekend. I even threw in my first aid kit just to be safe. The drive there was long and winding, and I didn't mind. It was one of those roads that felt like it stretched forever, barely touched by the outside world. By the time I pulled into the campsite parking area, it was nearing dusk. There were no other cars. That should have been a sign, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I grabbed my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and started hiking to the site. It wasn't a particularly hard walk, about a half-hour trek down a narrow path, but it was quiet, almost eerily so. The forest around me was dense, the trees thick with the last remnants of autumn. The leaves crunched underfoot, and the smell of pine and earth filled the air. The quiet was so thick, it felt almost oppressive. When I reached the campsite, it was exactly what I wanted. A small clearing, surrounded by trees, with a small creek trickling nearby. I was alone, just the way I liked it. I set up my tent quickly, getting a fire going shortly after. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and I could already feel the chill of the evening air creeping in. I cooked a simple dinner, some canned chili, and took my time eating as I watched the sunset. The fire crackled, and I listened to the sounds of the woods around me. Distant rustlings, the occasional bird call. I felt at peace. My mind started to wander, thinking about everything and nothing all at once. I was content. That feeling wouldn't last long. As darkness settled in, the forest around me seemed to grow stiller. It wasn't the typical peace of the woods at night. Usually, there's always some sound. An animal moving, insects chirping, the wind rustling the leaves. But here, there was only silence. I found it unsettling, but I tried to ignore it. I went to bed early that night, tired from the day's hike, and quickly fell into a restless sleep. Around midnight, I was awoken by a noise. It was faint at first, barely perceptible. A rustling sound, but not from the wind. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding in my chest. I lay there for a moment, straining my ears, but the noise stopped. For a while, it was just the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a small animal, maybe, a raccoon or a squirrel. I'd heard those sounds before when camping, but then the noise came again. This time it was closer. I sat up in my tent, listening intently. There it was again, a soft rustling, like something brushing against the brush or moving through the underbrush. But it wasn't an animal. It sounded deliberate, like someone or something was moving carefully through the woods, trying to be quiet but not succeeding. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, my hands shaking slightly. The beam of light flickered in the darkness, revealing nothing but the trees surrounding me. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The noise came again, closer this time, and I froze. It was a distinct crunching sound, as though something heavy was stepping on the dry leaves and twigs just outside my tent. I held my breath, listening, waiting for it to stop. I strained to hear over the pounding of my own heart. Then, there was a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, a rustling, and a twig snapping directly outside. That was when I knew it wasn't an animal. It was too human, too deliberate. I felt a surge of panic. My first instinct was to run, but the logical part of my mind quickly reminded me that running would only make me more vulnerable. I had no idea who or what was out there. I took a deep breath and slowly unzipped the tent, inch by inch, trying not to make a sound. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, scanning the area. My hands were clammy, my body tense with fear. The forest was eerily still. No movement, nothing. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped out of the tent, keeping low to the ground. My flashlight illuminated the trees and the ground around me. Nothing seemed out of place, but I knew something was wrong. I crept around the campsite, checking every direction. That's when I saw it. A footprint. It was fresh, just made. The dirt was soft, the edges still sharp. It was large, too large to be from any animal. It looked like a boot print. Someone had been walking through the woods near my campsite, and they hadn't tried to hide it. Panic clawed at my chest. I quickly returned to my tent, grabbing my backpack and my phone. I tried calling the park ranger station, but there was no service. Of course, there wasn't. This was one of the reasons I'd come to this spot, away from everything. I couldn't stay. I knew that much, but I also knew I had to be careful. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't going to leave me alone unless I made sure I didn't give them a reason to follow me. I grabbed my things and packed them quickly, moving quietly so I wouldn't alert whoever was out there that I was about to leave. I decided the safest route was to head back down the path I'd come from. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only way I could think of to get away from the campsite without being cornered. As I began walking down the trail, I heard it again. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable, following behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I forced myself not to look back. The path twisted, narrowing as I walked deeper into the forest. It was almost as though the woods themselves were closing in on me. I moved faster, the sound of footsteps growing louder. They were right behind me now. I could feel it. And then, just as I thought I was about to be caught, the trail opened up into a small clearing. I couldn't see anyone, but the sounds stopped. The air was still. There was no movement, no rustling. I didn't stop. I kept walking, the flashlight beam trembling in my hands, until I reached the end of the trail. The parking area was in sight, and that's when I finally heard the sound of a car engine. It was a truck, pulling into the lot. My heart surged with hope. I rushed forward, nearly tripping over my own feet. As I got closer, I saw the headlights of the truck, casting a long shadow. The truck stopped, and the door opened. A man stepped out. He looked at me, his face puzzled. "You okay?" he asked. I couldn't even speak at first. I just nodded, too relieved to do anything else. I got into the truck with him, and we drove out of the forest together. I never looked back. I made it home that night, and I haven't gone camping since. It had been a rough few weeks at work. The kind of days where the light of the office felt like a distant memory, buried beneath endless meetings and urgent emails. I've been looking for a chance to disconnect. I found it when I booked a weekend camping trip at a place called Forgotten Creek, somewhere out in the wild hills of Idaho. It wasn't a well-known spot, not like some of the national parks or the bustling campsites that everyone went to. but that was what appealed to me. Peace, solitude, no one to bother me for a few days. I'd made the decision on impulse. I just turned 29, and my life was moving fast in all the wrong directions. I needed time alone, time to think, time to get away from the noise of everything. Packing up my gear, I checked my map again. An old-school paper map that I had picked up at a gas station along the way. There wasn't much to the place, just a few dirt roads and a scattering of trails, but that's what I wanted. I didn't need amenities or well-marked paths, just a spot where I could find my peace. The drive to Forgotten Creek was long and winding, with the road thinning out as I neared the forest. The trees here were thick, dark green, and the air felt fresher with every mile I drove. I passed by a few scattered cabins and a handful of ranches, but after a while, I didn't see another soul. The quiet was almost overwhelming, just the sound of my truck engine and the occasional birds calling in the distance. I parked near the edge of a small clearing just beyond a thicket of trees. The campsite was basic. No bathroom, no water, just a fire pit and a few flat patches of ground to pitch a tent. It was perfect. I grabbed my gear and started setting up my camp, careful to keep everything in place. The sun had already dipped low, casting long shadows across the clearing. I didn't plan to do much for the evening, just get my tent set up and have a quiet meal. I unpacked my stove, boiled some water, and ate quickly, watching the fire burn steadily in front of me. The air had turned crisp, and I could hear the rustling of the trees as the wind picked up. As the night crept in, the world grew quiet. It was the kind of quiet that only the wilderness can offer. No cars, no chatter, just the distant calls of animals and the crackling of my fire. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, leaning back against the cold, hard ground. I closed my eyes for a moment, just letting the silence sink in. This was what I needed. This was peace. But that peace didn't last. The first sound that broke the calm came from deep within the woods. It was a low, guttural noise, a distant growl, almost like a wild animal in distress. My first thought was that it was just a coyote, but something about it felt off. The growl was too deep, too unsettling. I tensed up, listening intently. There it was again, faint but unmistakable. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably just the wind playing tricks, or maybe a distant bear or wolf. The trees here were dense, and the wildlife was unpredictable. But the sound grew louder, closer. A branch snapped nearby, and I jerked my head toward the noise. My heart rate quickened, and I stood up, scanning the dark treeline. I couldn't see anything, just shadows. I knew I was alone out here, and I was starting to wonder if maybe it hadn't been such a good idea after all to come out here on my own. The sounds didn't stop. I could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate. Heavy, not animal footsteps, human. My stomach twisted in a knot. I wasn't sure who or what was out there, but I knew one thing. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on and sweeping it across the clearing. The light barely cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything at first. The noise, though, it was closer now, too close. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Maybe it was another camper, someone who'd wandered off the trail. I called out, though I didn't know why. There was no answer. The rustling grew louder again, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the footsteps weren't from a lost hiker or another camper. These steps were too heavy, too deliberate. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, as the unmistakable crunch of a heavy footstep hit the ground just behind my tent. I knew then that this wasn't just a coincidence. Someone was here. Someone was watching me. I moved slowly, keeping low, grabbing my knife from my backpack. I wasn't sure what to do next. The darkness seemed to close in on me, and every noise, every movement felt magnified. I crept toward the fire, trying to stay out of sight, when I heard the crunch of a branch snapping from behind me. I whipped around, heart racing, but there was nothing. I stared into the blackness, searching for any movement. Nothing. I was alone, for now. My mind raced. What should I do? I couldn't just sit there. The feeling that something was wrong kept gnawing at me. It was then that I realized just how vulnerable I was out here. There was no one for miles, no help to be found. If something happened, it would be up to me to survive. I stayed as still as possible, my senses on high alert. I could hear the distant sound of rustling leaves, and the growling noise echoed once again. Only now it was closer, much closer. Then, a flash of movement. Something or someone passed just outside the circle of light cast by the fire. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I call the authorities? The idea felt almost laughable in this remote area. The nearest town was hours away. I needed to think fast, but the adrenaline was making it hard to focus. I quickly grabbed my sleeping bag and stuffed it into my pack, ready to go. I wasn't sticking around to find out what was out there. Just as I started to turn, I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The voice was low, almost a whisper, yet it carried through the stillness. "You shouldn't have come here." My blood ran cold. I didn't stop to think. I turned and ran. I moved through the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest, legs trembling beneath me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted through the trees, not caring where I was going. I just needed to get away. I don't know how far I ran. It felt like hours, but when I finally stopped, I found myself at the edge of a cliff overlooking a river below. I could hear the sound of rushing water, but I didn't dare go any closer. Instead, I crouched behind a large boulder, trying to steady my breathing, my mind racing. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the sound of the voice, maybe the way the footsteps had been following me, but everything about this place felt wrong. It wasn't just the isolation. It wasn't just the strange noises. There was something off about the whole area, like it was hiding something. I waited in the darkness for what felt like hours, afraid to move. The sounds seemed to die down, and the night became still again. I slowly rose from behind the boulder, scanning my surroundings. Nothing. No more footsteps. No more growls. No voice. Just silence. It wasn't until dawn that I decided to leave. I made my way back to my camp, packed up quickly, and headed to my truck. I drove away without looking back, feeling a strange mix of relief and regret. I never went back to Forgotten Creek. I never told anyone about that night either. There were no answers, no explanations, only the eerie feeling that something or someone had been watching me the entire time. That feeling stayed with me long after I left the woods, as if the forest had its own secret it wasn't ready to share. It had been years since I'd gone camping, but when the opportunity came up, I jumped at the chance. The trip was planned on a whim and it felt right. A quick getaway to clear my mind and experience the simple peace of nature again. I was 34 years old, and though I had a love for the outdoors, I hadn't been out for a long while. Life, as it often does, had gotten in the way. So when my friend Josh invited me to join him for a weekend in the woods near the northern border of Idaho, I was all in. The plan was to hike for a few hours, set up camp at a secluded spot near a small lake, and spend the night there. It was just the two of us. That was the plan. Simple, peaceful. We figured we would be away from all the noise and distractions, and we'd be able to reset, recharge, and enjoy the kind of silence you can only get when you're in the middle of nowhere. We set off on a Friday afternoon, right after work. The hike wasn't especially hard, but it was enough to work up a bit of a sweat. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, and the cool mountain air was a relief after the long hours spent inside the office. As we hiked deeper into the woods, I could feel the stress of daily life slipping away, each step forward making me feel more and more like I had made the right decision. Josh had been here before, so he knew the trails and the campgrounds well. He had camped in this part of Idaho many times, and I trusted him. We'd been friends since high school, and even though we didn't talk much during the year, these trips were the kind of thing that kept our friendship solid. We eventually arrived at the lake just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. It was stunning, still and serene, the reflection of the trees and the sky making the water look like glass. There was a sense of calm that you can only get from being in a place like this, away from people and the chaos of everyday life. Setting up camp was quick. We found a good spot on the shoreline, set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and got a campfire going. The light from the fire cast long shadows against the surrounding trees, but it was warm, and I could already feel myself unwinding. As the night went on, we ate, talked, and enjoyed the fire. Josh had brought along a couple of beers, which we shared as we talked about old memories, catching up on life, and discussing whatever popped into our heads. The sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, the crackling fire, the occasional hoot of an owl were comforting. But then, about an hour after the fire started to die down, Josh suddenly got quiet. He was looking toward the trees, where the light from the fire barely reached. I didn't think much of it at first. I just assumed he was lost in thought. But when I followed his gaze, something caught my eye too. A movement. Something or someone was out there. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, but it didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. I couldn't make out the shape clearly, but it seemed to be standing still, watching us. I kept staring, hoping it would move again so I could figure out what it was. But it didn't. It just stood there. "Josh?" I started, but he was already standing up. "I'll check it out," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of uncertainty. Before I could say anything, he grabbed the flashlight from his bag and walked toward the trees. I stayed by the fire, a mix of unease and curiosity creeping in. The flames flickered, throwing long shadows across the ground, and the air felt a little colder. The sound of crickets had stopped, and everything seemed too still. Josh was gone for a long time, longer than I expected. My mind started to race, and I found myself fighting the urge to go after him. What if he had tripped? What if he was hurt? What if he found something dangerous? But I didn't want to leave the camp, so I stayed put. I told myself that everything would be fine, that he was just checking things out, and that he'd be back soon. It wasn't until about 30 minutes had passed that I started to really worry. I couldn't hear anything, not even his footsteps, just the sound of the fire crackling in the silence. My heart began to pound in my chest as I stood up and grabbed the flashlight myself. I headed toward the trees, keeping the beam of light steady in front of me. I didn't call out for him. The last thing I wanted was to alert whatever had been out there earlier. I wanted to keep quiet, keep my senses sharp. When I reached the spot where I'd last seen Josh, I stopped. Nothing. No sign of him. No footsteps. No broken branches. It was as if he had disappeared. A sudden wave of panic hit me, and I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself down. Maybe he had just walked farther than I thought. Maybe he was checking something out deeper in the woods. I called out quietly, "Josh!" My voice was shaky, but the forest swallowed it up. The flashlight beam danced over the trees as I walked deeper into the woods. Every sound now seemed magnified. My own footsteps crunching on the dry leaves, the occasional gust of wind rustling through the branches, and the sound of my own breath growing heavier as the tension mounted. I had no idea how far I had gone, but I could feel the creeping sensation that I was being watched. I stopped and listened. Nothing. The only sounds now were my own breath and the distant call of an owl. That's when I heard something, a rustle of leaves. It was faint, but it was enough to make my heart race. I froze, shining the flashlight in the direction of the sound. It was too dark to see clearly, but something was out there, moving between the trees. "Josh!" I called again, my voice louder this time, but still no response. Then suddenly the sound came again, closer this time. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I turned to leave. But just as I did, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow moving between the trees, not far from where I stood. Without thinking, I bolted. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally made it back to the camp, breathless and panicked, I didn't see Josh. The fire had almost gone out, and the shadows around the camp seemed darker than before. My mind was racing. Where was he? What happened? Then, from the edge of the trees, I heard something, a whisper of movement. I turned quickly, shining the flashlight in the direction of the sound. My heart stopped. It was Josh. His clothes were torn, and he had scratches all over his arms and face. He was breathing heavily, eyes wide and wild. His hair was matted with sweat, and his expression was one of sheer terror. I rushed to him, calling his name, but he didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was shaky. "We need to go. Now." Without another word, I grabbed my things, and we packed up in silence. We didn't look back, didn't waste time trying to understand what had happened. We just knew we had to get out. We packed as quickly as we could, the fear driving our actions. We moved in haste, not stopping until we were a good distance from the camp. As we walked back down the trail toward the car, Josh told me what had happened. He'd gone deeper into the woods, but when he tried to follow the movement he had seen, he found something, or rather, someone. He couldn't explain it clearly, but whatever it was had followed him. It was human-sized, but the way it moved was wrong, too quiet, too fast. And there was something about its eyes that had terrified him. We didn't talk much after that. We made it back to the car without any further incident, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The whole way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following us. We didn't return to that area again. And though I never saw what Josh saw, I know he wasn't lying. I'll never forget the look in his eyes when he came back to camp. Whatever it was real. We made it out that night, safe, but that trip changed me. It made me realize just how vulnerable we are when we're out there, alone in the wilderness. The woods can be peaceful, but they can also be dangerous. And sometimes the most dangerous thing is what's out there, just beyond the trees, watching you. It was mid-October when I decided to go camping alone. I had always enjoyed the quiet solitude of the mountains, the feeling of being away from everything, and the peace that comes with being surrounded by nature. My name is Jake. I'm 32 years old, and this was my first solo camping trip in a long time. I've been on plenty of trips with friends, but something about the idea of being alone, completely immersed in nature, seemed appealing. I chose a spot in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, a place I'd heard was a bit off the beaten path. Not a lot of people knew about it, which was exactly what I wanted. I didn't want to run into anyone. The trailhead was about an hour from the nearest town, and from there, it would be a couple of hours on foot to reach the campsite I had in mind. It wasn't far, but the remoteness made me feel like I was in a completely different world. I packed my gear the night before: a tent, sleeping bag, food, and a few tools, including a hatchet and a small utility knife. I wasn't overly concerned about wild animals. After all, I'd grown up camping and knew how to make myself known to them, keep a safe distance, and store food properly. I had a basic map of the area, but I knew the terrain pretty well from the many trips I had taken with friends in years past. The hike was challenging but not too difficult. The path wound through dense woods, where the canopy of trees blocked out much of the sun, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The leaves were just beginning to change, so there were patches of bright yellow and orange scattered across the forest floor. The crisp autumn air was refreshing, and I felt alive with every step I took, the sound of my boots crunching through the fallen leaves echoing in the stillness. When I reached the campsite, it was exactly as I had imagined it: peaceful, isolated, and beautiful. There was a small clearing just big enough for my tent, with a little stream running through the nearby rocks. I set up camp quickly, carefully placing my tent in a spot where I could see the surrounding area clearly. The evening was drawing closer, and the light was starting to fade, so I decided to build a fire. The crackling of the fire was the only sound as the night slowly fell around me. I sat there for a while, watching the flames dance and feeling the warmth on my face. I hadn't seen a single other person since the trailhead, and a sense of calm settled over me. I had planned to stay for 2 nights, but as the sun began to set, I started to feel something I hadn't expected: unease. It was small at first, a subtle feeling in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't quite right. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the isolation. Maybe it was the way the wind had started to pick up, rustling the trees in a way that felt different. The air was cooler now, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. The wind howled through the treetops, and the sound of the fire snapping and crackling seemed amplified in the quiet. I took out a book to distract myself. I read a few pages, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. Every time the wind picked up, It seemed like something was moving just outside the light of the fire. The flickering shadows gave the impression that there was something watching me. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but the feeling only grew stronger as the minutes ticked by. I decided to head to bed early. It was just after 9 p.m., but the forest had grown unnervingly silent. No animals, no insects, just the soft rustling of the trees in the wind. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it up, and tried to settle down. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind raced, and the sensation that something was out there, something I couldn't see, lingered. Hours passed. Every small noise outside the tent made me tense. The crunch of a branch, a distant snap of twigs. Even the wind, which had been howling earlier, now felt too quiet. It was as though the entire forest had held its breath. I was starting to drift off when I heard it. A soft, unmistakable rustle from the woods, just outside the tent. My heart stopped. It wasn't the wind this time. It was too controlled, too deliberate. It wasn't an animal either. It sounded like someone, or something, was moving around, circling the tent. I held my breath, waiting. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. The air felt colder, and I felt my pulse quicken. I had no idea what to do. There was no way I could just ignore it. I had a small flashlight in my bag, but if it was someone or something out there, I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I sat still, listening. The sound came again. This time, it was directly outside the tent. I could hear it so clearly now. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the fear creeping up my spine. The minutes stretched on, and I knew something wasn't right. I waited for what felt like an eternity before finally deciding to peek outside. I unzipped the door of my tent just a crack and shone my flashlight into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the dark outline of the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I exhaled slowly, trying to convince myself it had all been in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. The air felt thick, heavy, like the forest was watching me. I closed the tent door, pulled the flap tight, and tried to get some sleep. But sleep was impossible now. The rest of the night passed in a blur of half-formed thoughts and uneasy, shallow breaths. Every noise outside felt like it was getting closer, but every time I checked, there was nothing. Morning came, eventually. The sun was just beginning to rise, and the forest was bathed in a soft, golden light. The air felt clearer, and the sharp edge of the fear that had been gnawing at me all night seemed to fade slightly with the first rays of dawn. I got out of my tent, stretching my stiff muscles and rubbing my tired eyes. The forest looked different in the daylight, still beautiful, still peaceful. But there was a sense of emptiness now, as though something was missing. I gathered my things, packed up camp, and decided to head back down the trail. As I was gathering my gear, I noticed something strange. The ground near my tent was disturbed. Footprints, leading in a circle around where I had been sleeping. They weren't animal tracks. They were too large, too deliberate. I felt a chill run through me as I crouched down to examine them. The prints were fresh. Whoever or whatever had been out there had been walking around my tent, watching me. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to acknowledge the feeling that something had been out there, something I couldn't see, but I couldn't ignore the evidence in front of me. I couldn't shake the image of those slow, deliberate footsteps. The realization hit me hard. I had been in danger. I had no idea who or what was out there, but the fact that I hadn't heard anything during the night, that I hadn't seen a single sign of life in the morning, made me feel like I was the one who didn't belong. I didn't stick around to find out who or what had been watching me. I packed up my things, leaving the campsite as it was, and made my way back to the trailhead as quickly as I could. When I finally reached the car, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. The trail was behind me, and the threat, whatever it had been, was now just a distant memory. I didn't talk about it to anyone. I didn't want to sound paranoid or crazy, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be camping alone in that part of the mountains again, ever. I've been on plenty of camping trips since then, but nothing has ever felt quite as unsettling as that night. It wasn't just the footsteps or the feeling of being watched. It was the unknown. The fact that something was out there, something that knew exactly what it was doing. And I had no idea who or what it was. I never returned to that campsite. I never even went back to that part of the mountains. Maybe it was a one-time thing. Maybe it was just my imagination. But I'll never know for sure. And that uncertainty, the not knowing, still haunts me to this day. It was early autumn when I decided to take a break from the usual grind. I'd been working in the city for a few years, and the constant hum of cars, people, and screens had started to get to me. I needed quiet. I needed space. So, I packed up my tent, some food, a couple of books, and set off on a solo camping trip into the backcountry. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, which in hindsight was a poor decision, but at the time I just needed the escape. I was about 28 years old, never really spent too much time camping before, but I'd done a few weekend trips here and there. I figured a weekend in the woods would be a good opportunity to disconnect completely. After a few hours of driving, I arrived at a remote campsite nestled in the woods near the Sierra Nevada mountains. It wasn't a popular spot, which was exactly what I was after. It was a spot I'd found on a camping website, listed as off the beaten path and perfect for solitude. I arrived in the early afternoon, the sun high but starting to dip toward the horizon. The air had that crisp, clean feeling of fall, fresh and cool, with that hint of dryness that comes just before the weather turns colder. I parked my car at the trailhead and set off on foot, following the path that would lead me to the campsite. The trail was narrow, winding between towering pine trees and dense thickets of underbrush. The deeper I got into the forest, the quieter it became. The strange how quickly nature can swallow sound. The noise of the world, even the wind, seemed to fade into the background. It was just me, the dirt path beneath my boots, and the occasional rustle of leaves. The first day was easy. I set up my tent in a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees that stood like silent sentinels. I built a fire, not too big, just enough to cook some dinner and ward off the evening chill. As the light faded, I noticed how much darker it became in the woods compared to the city. The kind of dark where your own thoughts start to feel a little more intrusive, a little louder. I wasn't scared, though. In fact, I felt more at ease than I had in a long time. Just the crackle of the fire and the occasional snap of a twig from some creature moving through the brush. Night crept up on me quickly. The stars above, uninhibited by city lights, were brilliant. I sat by the fire, eating a small meal of canned beans and crackers, content and tired from the hike. The flickering of the flames cast long shadows that danced on the surrounding trees. Everything felt safe. But as the night deepened, something started to feel off. I couldn't place it at first. It was just a subtle shift, like something had changed in the air. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest, like the chirping of crickets or the distant hoot of an owl, that were missing. It was something more. It was the absence of those sounds. An almost unnatural stillness settled in around me. First, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just my imagination. I'd been working long hours leading up to this trip. Maybe I was just overtired. But as the fire crackled and I leaned back against a log, I started hearing something. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized the sound was too consistent. It wasn't the wind moving through the branches. It was a steady rustling, coming from the trees just beyond my campsite. I told myself it was just some small animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon, something harmless. But the rustling didn't stop. It was too deliberate, too steady, like something was moving purposefully through the woods, staying just out of sight. I tried to focus on the fire, watching the flames as they flickered. I wasn't scared. I kept telling myself I wasn't scared, but there was this unease gnawing at the back of my mind. The rustling grew louder. It was closer now, almost as if it was circling my campsite. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, trying to shake off the anxiety building in my chest. I walked toward the noise, my feet crunching on the forest floor, my heart thudding louder with each step. I reached the edge of my campfire's light, where the trees grew thick and dark. The rustling had stopped. I stood there, flashlight in hand, scanning the area. Nothing. just shadows, just the dark. My mind raced. I could hear my breath, fast and shallow, but the forest around me had returned to its normal state of quiet. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting for some sign of movement, but nothing happened. After a while, I convinced myself it had been nothing, maybe a squirrel or a deer, like I originally thought. I returned to my campfire, trying to push the feeling of dread from my chest. I sat back down on the log, staring into the flames. But then I heard it again, a snap, a twig breaking, followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving through the underbrush. And this time it was closer. My heart jumped into my throat, and I stood up immediately. There was no mistaking it now, it was too deliberate, too close. Something or someone was out there. I grabbed my knife from the bag I'd left by the tent and turned back toward the source of the noise. My hands were shaking now, and I had to steady myself before taking another step. I walked carefully through the woods, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The night had grown colder, and my breath came in little puffs, visible in the beam of my flashlight. There was nothing. I had reached the edge of the clearing, where the trees stood like black sentinels, but no movement, no rustling, just the shadows of the night. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or even more unnerved. The rustling stopped, but now there was something else. A low, soft noise, almost like breathing. I turned sharply, scanning the area. It was quiet now, the only sound being the wind rustling through the treetops. It was too quiet. I felt a lump form in my throat as the realization hit me. Something was wrong. Something was watching me. The thought didn't come from fear, but from a deep primal instinct that had suddenly kicked in. Suddenly, I heard a distant shout. It was a human voice, but it wasn't anyone I knew. It was hoarse, strained, like someone was calling for help, or perhaps warning me. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my pulse quickened. I strained to hear, but it was just the wind again. The distant voice had faded. I couldn't tell if I'd imagined it or if it had been real, but that was enough for me. I quickly returned to my campsite. I packed my things in a hurry, heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins. There was no reason to stick around anymore. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't something I wanted to meet face to face. By the time I was finished packing, it was late, and the forest felt alive with unseen eyes. I grabbed my gear and headed back down the trail, not looking back. Every step felt like it was taking me farther away from something I didn't understand but knew was dangerous.